Game of Thrones, The Wrath of the Sleeping Dragon. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 626, The North. The years in King's Landing pass quickly. Apart from some military and national affairs, there were only some trivial matters. The Night's Watch, which was nominally absorbed into the kingdom's military system, and was the 5th Legion, finally passed through the twin cities of the Brackens after a long journey, and arrived at the Neck. The kingdom's current military deployment mostly focuses on important cities and strongholds. Ordinary castles and villages rely on the private soldiers of local nobles and the villagers themselves to protect their homes. For example, a Baron 2nd Legion is stationed next to King's Landing to guard the capital. The Golden Corps, the 3rd Legion, moved to the Neck after the war and built solid fortifications and semi-permanent camps. This is related to the strategic direction of the country in the future. Sooner or later, the White Walkers will make a comeback. At that time, the Night's Watch is the first line of defense, and the second line of defense is the Golden Corps at the southern end of the Neck. The third line of defense is in King's Landing. If the capital cannot be defended, it can flee to the continent of Essos as soon as possible. As for the densely populated important cities in Westeros such as Old Town, Linersport, and Gulltown, they are now guarded by the city garrison. Like Highgarden, they have become the private land of the royal family. Viserys plans to set up the position of governor in these important cities in the future, with capable people on the rise and incompetent people on the decline, so that they can become cities directly under the king and the engine of the national economy, instead of missing out on good development opportunities as in the past, and having to stand still, or even eat the old capital. Of course, Viserys' plan is not just to open ports and attach importance to business. In today's environment, where internal productivity is backward and the outside world is full of wealthy businessmen, opening ports is equivalent to being plundered of wealth, taking one step at a time, and eating one bite at a time. The Night's Watch began to make steady progress after crossing the Neck. Another fleet of the Kingdom Navy, led by Earl Geoffrey Bracken, landed in White Harbor to clean up the remaining whites here. White Harbor had been swept by the Dothraki before, so now the kingdom's navy did not spend too much effort to clear the whites after successfully landing at White Harbor, and soon gained a foothold here. But the cold wind and frost north of the Neck still became a great obstacle. The cold did not seem to leave with the retreat of the dead army. The human army crossed the Neck, but it was still a world of ice and snow, and everything was dead and silent. I don't think humans can survive in such an environment. In the Night's Watch, a knight in a black cloak looked at the snowflakes falling from the sky with worry, then turned his head and spoke to Eddard Stark beside him. Although those who joined the Night's Watch were all sinners and should not keep the family emblem, after all, they would always have some psychological sustenance when they were thousands of miles away from home. This was a knight from the south. He had never seen such a terrible world of ice and snow. These white snowflakes looked like white devils to him. In fact, the environment north of the wall is like this all year round, and it's even much colder than here. Eddard Stark was wearing a black cloak with the emblem of the dire wolf embroidered on his chest, and his face was weathered. If the wildlings can survive, we can too. He also looked up at the gradually darkening sky, and then looked around at the flat land around him, which was a suitable place to set up camp. Eddard knew that today's journey was about to end here, so he turned over and got off the horse, stepped on the snow on the ground, and exhaled a long breath of white air. As the night gradually enveloped, the march of the Night's Watch came to an end. Stop moving forward. Stop moving forward. Set up camp. A messenger riding a war horse passed through the army, shouting loudly, conveying the order of Commander Mormont. Click. The army gradually stopped, and the subsequent escorted supplies came up, including fur tents that could keep out the cold, kerosene for making fire, and today's dinner. However, only kerosene without a combustion aid is not enough. Although the cold climate eliminated a large number of naturally growing species, there are still cold-resistant plants and animals that survived. After receiving the order to set up camp, the soldiers of the Night's Watch began to collect firewood everywhere to burn for heating. Let's go. Sir Clifton. Eddard Stark abandoned his status as a duke and is now just an ordinary soldier without any achievements. He is not as high as his brother Benjen, so he naturally has to collect firewood himself. However, despite this, no one dared to come forward to humiliate him. After all, there are only more than 1,000 real Night's Watch soldiers now, and the tens of thousands of northern soldiers outside are just nominal Night's Watch soldiers. They can return to their hometowns after serving. The Stark family is still the Stark family. The rule of the dire wolf in the north is deeply rooted. Although his son is no longer the guardian of the north, he is also the future governor of the north with a different name. He is just temporarily staying in King's Landing as a hostage. And Eddard's sword at this moment is no longer the family's ancestral two-handed sword ice. The Valyrian steel two-handed sword ice was seized after the Battle of Riverrun. It is now stored in the treasury and has not been returned to the Stark family, perhaps as a punishment for this battle. Also placed in the treasury is the broken heart of the Tully family. Randall Tully disappeared during the Battle of Riverrun. No one can be seen alive or dead. Only his sword broken heart was found, and then it was also collected in the treasury and covered with dust. People are willing to believe that the best star in Westeros, the tough Earl of Hornhill, was melted on the battlefield by dragon flames, and they are also unwilling to believe that he may be hiding in a corner of the world, trying to come back for revenge. Caca. Eddard Stark cut the last firewood with a sword, then exhaled a little white mist, bent down to pick them all up, and threw them into the bonfire. At this time, Gian Mormont, the commander-in-chief of the Night's Watch, and the new Maester Pycelle, who was shivering from the cold, and Halfdan Colin and others came over. Lord Eddard Stark. Eddard heard the voice, and raised his head to see the people walking towards him, then stood up straight, and bowed slightly to Gian Mormont. Lord Commander. There is one thing we want to ask you, Lord Stark. The serious expression on the face of old Lord Commander Mormont made Eddard's heart tighten slightly. What? You will know, if you come and take a look. Chapter 627 Dire Alfhead. The serious expression on Lord Commander Mormont's face seemed to indicate that this was not a good thing. The same was true on Eddard Stark's weather-beaten face. Then the northerner pondered for a moment and nodded slightly. His calm tone could even be mistaken for arrogance and indifference. In that case, let's go. Eddard briefly forgot that he was now a soldier of the Night's Watch instead of a high-ranking Duke of the North. He strode forward with one hand on the hilt of his sword. Under the grey wolf skin was a black cloak, which fluttered slightly in the wind. On the other side, Corin the Halfdan saw this scene and quickly glanced at Lord Commander Gian Mormont, and found that Mormont had no objection to this. After all, old Mormont was once a vassal who swore allegiance to the Stark family. Although his status was temporarily above Eddard, it would be a loss of honor if he was arrogant. Gian Mormont was not a person of such character. Lord Eddard Stark, we have met before. I am. Maester Pycelle, who had a chain around his neck, came over at this time and spoke tremblingly. The former white-bearded Maester had his Maester chain taken away, but Pycelle found her chain from somewhere and put it back on. However, there were no rules of the Citadel in the Night's Watch, and no one cared about his little tricks. However, when Eddard Stark passed by Maester Pycelle and heard his words, he just nodded slightly and greeted him simply. Grand Maester Pycelle, we have met before. Then he continued to walk forward without waiting for him to finish, leaving only the white-bearded old man pretending to have difficulty in walking to catch up with the others. Eddard Stark, Lord Commander Mormont, Maester Pycelle and others came and went in a hurry and soon returned to the scene of the incident. However, many Night's Watch soldiers had already gathered here. Everyone gathered together and looked inside, and from time to time, there were panicked sounds. Oh my god. It's terrible. Is this the enemy we will face in the future? Many of the Night's Watch soldiers who were watching were southern nobles who were exiled to the border after the King's Landing judgment meeting. Some of them had never seen the White Walkers, but had only heard of their names. However, after seeing the masterpieces of these monsters, they were inevitably panicked. Relatively speaking, the soldiers in the north were calmer. Almost most of the northern soldiers who survived today had experienced the war against the White Walkers in the past. Only a few were refugees from the north, who were recruited later. They had fought these monsters head on, but they had never seen such a horrible scene. They couldn't help but look at each other and whisper to each other, "Get out of the way. Get out of the way." Lord Commander Jim Mormont. Lord Eddard Stark. At this time, Eddard and old Lord Commander Mormont arrived from the rear. Driven by the Raven Yoren and other veterans of the Night's Watch, the crowd consciously made way for a few people to squeeze in and see the scene in front of them. Hiss. Eddard Stark, who had just seen this scene, could not help but gasp, his dark brows furrowed. The scene in front of him was somewhat shocking, with corpses and broken limbs everywhere, and frozen blood on the ground, which was wantonly splashed on the land and snow. Human arms and warhorse heads began to spiral from a center, eventually forming a huge windmill. If you look down from the sky, it is a weird giant formation, which is breathtaking. Are these damn guys doing art again? Eddard frowned, exhaled a breath of white air, then turned his head and looked at Lord Commander Jim Mormont and said, the two had fought side by side at the wall and even at Winterfell. The first White Walker to be killed in modern history was killed by King Robert himself, and at that time Eddard and Jim Mormont had seen the art created by the White Walkers. They love to use human or animal corpses to form some strange patterns, and the intention is not very clear. Intimidation? Do the White Walkers want to scare away humans? Or is it some kind of dark sacrificial ritual that they don't know about? The White Walkers piled up corpses into a large formation and then sacrificed to an unknown evil god. More than that. However, the commander-in-chief of the Night's Watch, who was bald with only a circle of pale hair around his head, shook his head and said, torches. His face was still serious. He called his subordinates to bring torches, then exhaled a breath of white air, and walked towards the center of the formation. Follow me, Lord Stark. Eddard was a little confused. He didn't know what old Mormont meant, but he still followed him behind him with the hilt of his sword, and walked towards the middle area. Soon a Night's Watch soldier in black handed over a torch. Old Lord Commander Mormont took it, and walked to the center of the circle to shine forward. Now the sky has completely darkened. Just now, it was a little difficult to see the center of the giant circle from the outside. But when he walked in front of it, the torch dispelled the darkness, and Ed finally saw what was in the center of the circle. It was a huge wolf head. Ed was willing to swear that it was the largest wolf head he had ever seen. Its once snow-white fur had now become a little dirty, covered with blood and dust. Its face was hideous and its fangs were bared. Its pair of red eyes were wide open, looking at the two people holding torches in front of it unwillingly, as if it might suddenly open its mouth and bite them at any time. Is this a dire wolf? Ed walked in front of the wolf head, then squatted down to observe it carefully. He held the dagger on his waist with one hand, fearing that the other party would suddenly attack and bite people. You know, this is not the first time that the White Walkers have played such a trick. There was another time before when the White Walkers also arranged the corpses of humans and animals into a strange formation. When the human soldiers approached, the heads of these corpses suddenly opened their mouths and screamed, which scared the soldiers to death and even left them with psychological trauma. Ed had recognized that this huge wolf head was from the emblem of the Stark family. The dire wolf should not live south of the wall. Do you think this is a warning, Lord Stark? Commander Mormont looked at Eddard squatting on the ground with a torch in his hand, and then asked. However, Eddard turned a deaf ear to his voice, and instead stared at a wooden bow that fell next to the dire wolf head, then reached out, and picked it up, and looked at it carefully. Then when Eddard turned the small wooden bow over, he saw a line of small words engraved in the place where the small wooden bow was held, engraved with Lyanna Stark in a childish handwriting. Chapter 628. Human heart is unpredictable. The dire wolf head. This is undoubtedly a warning from the White Walkers to us. I remember that your majesty went on a northern tour a long time ago. Didn't your majesty see this formation? Only by looking down from the sky can you see the full picture of this human head formation. If Viserys flew through the sky on a dragon, he should have seen this human head formation. However, don't talk nonsense, your majesty. Then someone's speculation was scolded by others. The command tent of the Night's Watch Legion camp was in a mess. People were talking about this human head formation, especially the dire wolf head in it. This is a naked warning from the White Walkers to humans. It seems that they know that the Stark family is destined to embark on this journey back home. In the messy crowd, Eddard Stark himself seemed very calm. His grey eyes looked at the map in front of him. This was a full view map of the north, but in the center of the map was the small wooden bow he had just found. This was the practice bow that his sister Liana used when she was a child. He was very impressed. This formation was newly built. Although the icy and snowy climate north of the neck has delayed the decay of the corpses to a certain extent, they did not die very long ago. The patrol teams we sent out have all returned, and there are not many casualties. According to speculation, they may be expedition teams organized by the free trade cities, and they were killed by the White Walkers. The person who spoke was the leading ranger in the Night's Watch, the former deputy commander of the Shadow Tower, the Broken Hand. He was considered a powerful person in the Legion. He could live alone outside the wall for a winter, and then return safely. His name was known to everyone among the wildlings, and many of them even hated him to the core. He was called the creator of widows and orphans. According to his long-term experience outside the wall, these people did not die too long ago, perhaps in the past few days. According to other people's speculation, this group of people was most likely sent by the trade city-states on the other side of the Narrow Sea. After all, this cold winter also had an impact on the other side of the Narrow Sea. In addition to that snowstorm, Bravos has had more than one heavy snowfall, because Bravos and the Neck are on the same line in latitude, and the seasons are roughly the same, but the Neck has never been so cold in previous years, almost like the outside of the Great Wall. Moreover, the people of the trading cities are particularly concerned about the wars and disasters that have occurred in Westeros, and the deserted north has become their place to explore. But these people are courageous, but it's a pity that they have chosen the wrong opponent. The White Walkers have caused hundreds of thousands of human coalition forces to collapse and lose battle after battle, which is not just fear. However, the death of this group of expedition teams or mercenaries from the trading cities is not a pity, but the words of Colin the Half-Handed frightened everyone present, including Rickard Karstark, the most popular northern steward. Rickard Karstark has now become the actual ruler of the Northern Army. But nominally, he still needs to obey the orders of Mormont, the commander-in-chief of the Night's Watch. Otherwise, it would be rebellion. The next day, His Majesty will ride the Black Death to the top of his head and send him rolling into the seven hells with a breath of dragon flame. Rickard knew this very well. His power came from Viserys' detention of Robb Stark in King's Landing. Although the young master was still the governor of the North in name, he was just a servant for a day without returning. If His Majesty detained him for life, then Rickard could be the governor of the North for life. This was also a finishing touch, which planted the hidden danger of discord between the monarch and his subjects in the North. When he first tasted this kind of power, Lord El of Kaha City had already fallen deeply into it. This feeling was something he had never felt before. Including the northern nobles who were around him now. They were still toasting yesterday, sitting around him, and flattering him to celebrate his becoming the Grand Steward of the North. And these people used to gather around Lord Eddard Stark, but Lord Stark faced his vassals with a cold attitude. Karstark actually, Karstark is also Stark. They have the same blood of the wolf flowing in their bodies, but they just formed a branch. Karstark's ancestors were in Fiaf to the city of Kaha, and then the name of Kaha was finally changed to Karstark. Since Stark can sit, why can't he? What's more, this era has changed. Except for the North, Dawn and the Iron Islands, the governors of other places have been replaced, even people like Littlefinger. Thinking of this, his inner restlessness became even more uncontrollable. The strong man with a grey beard heard the words of Half and Colin, and then secretly glanced at the feudal lord he once served, who was now wearing black clothes. Eddard Stark naturally didn't know what kind of changes his once most loyal old subordinates had undergone when they tasted the taste of power, and whether they would still be the trusted ministers he could rely on for his son. The people of the North are honest and seldom flexible. They don't understand the principles and rules of power. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been beaten to a pulp every time they went south. At this moment, he was thinking about what Colin the Broken Hand said. If he followed the words of the deputy commander of the Shadow Tower, it meant that the White Walkers were still in this land not long ago, and had just left. This was also the reason why everyone in the tent suddenly became quiet. Didn't they say that the White Walkers have retreated to the north of the wall? How can we fight the White Walkers without dragons? There was a commotion in the tent of the Night's Watch. Whether it was the southern nobles who were once sent to the Night's Watch or the northern nobles, they had become dependent on dragons. Should we ask for help, Your Majesty? They had lost the courage to fight the White Walkers without the support of dragons. In their opinion, only with dragons in front could human soldiers fight the White Walkers. The White Walkers won't come out to fight us. At this time, Commander Mormont, who was in the middle of the crowd, looked at the messy tent and couldn't help but speak loudly. Otherwise they would not have retreated, leaving behind only a single header in an attempt to scare us off. As soon as he spoke, everyone fell silent. No matter how Mormont came to be the commander-in-chief of the entire army, he was nominally the commander-in-chief, and no one dared to disobey him. After all, the Iron Throne stood behind him. Anyone who disobeyed Lord Commander Mormont was tantamount to rebelling against the Iron Throne and starting a rebellion. And everyone knew what happened to the last person who started a rebellion. Chapter 629 Determination. But there is one thing, if what Lord Stark said is correct, then the Night King has indeed resurrected the successive Northern Kings, including the modern members of the Stark family, to drive them to fight for him. At this point, Lord Commander Mormont's expression was inevitably serious. After all, the White Walkers' resurrection of the dead was shocking enough. And now the White Walkers have really resurrected the successive Northern Kings. If these people do not have the wisdom they had in their lifetime, it would be fine. But if they still have the wisdom they had in their lifetime, then each Northern King is a great man. The Night's Watch may not be able to get any benefits from facing these monsters. It seems that the rumor that King Robert was shot by Lyanna Stark on the battlefield is not groundless. Lord Commander Mormont then sighed and said, "Next, we must be extremely careful. Although the White Walkers did not fight with us, but chose to retreat directly, we still need to guard against a sudden counterattack from the other side. When necessary, I will ask for help from His Majesty and request to send Dragon Knights to help." Yes. The generals in the Central Army tent all looked serious, including Eddard Stark, who responded in unison. In the distant Red Castle, after half a month of discussion, Viserys and the Royal Council of the Kingdom unanimously passed the decision to send troops to the island of Naas. The Iron Throne decided to send a fleet of 2,000 people, consisting of several large tonnage main ships and dozens of escort boats. Asha Greyjoy, the daughter of the sea monster and former captain of the Black Wind, served as the commander of the entire army and the envoy of the Iron Throne. The fleet will depart from King's Landing, then first arrive in Pentos for supplies, and then follow the west coast of the Essos continent, visiting the surrounding free trade cities along the way. The first stop of the Iron Throne's fleet will be the ruins of Me destroyed by the Dothraki, as well as the newly established forces on this land. Me had been attacked by several Khals. The Dothraki hit a wall in Pentos and turned around to vent their anger on the Me people. Me suffered a devastating blow, and the city was massacred for several days, and all its wealth was looted. However, Mir is an ancient trading city-state with a deep foundation. After suffering a devastating blow, it stood up again. Some Me people who were away returned to their hometown and built a new city on this ruin, trying to become the new owner of this city. The first stop of the Iron Throne fleet is to visit Me, followed by Tyrosh and lies around the Disputed Lands. The Disputed Lands used to be a prosperous place under the rule of the Valyrian Freehold, but after the collapse of the Great Empire of Valyria, it also fell into war. It was briefly controlled by Volantis, then overthrown. With the support of Bravos, the Durrandon family and the Targaryen family, Pentos and Tyrosh turned the land into a scorched earth. Then Me, Tyrosh and Lys established the short-lived kingdom of the Three Daughters to resist the constant invasion of Volantis, but in the end Volantis lost interest in this place, and the kingdom of the Three Daughters collapsed, and soon fell into civil war. The triangle has stability. Me, Tyrosh and Lys may have once been a three-way balance of power, but now Me has been burned under the butcher knife of the Dothraki, and the conflict between Tyrosh and Lys over the disputed land has changed from the past easing to a tense situation. Both sides want to control this land, and even sent envoys to this place in the hope of winning the support of Pentos, the Targaryen family at that time. Due to geopolitical reasons, the only powerful forces that can influence the political situation in the disputed land are the newly rising empire on the other side of the Narrow Sea and Volantis. except that Viserys has not yet taken the initiative to proclaim himself emperor. The outside world has already called Westeros, Andalus and Pentos the Empire, and regarded them as the most powerful forces in the world. Therefore, this voyage is crucial, and it is related to the stability of the political situation in the disputed lands and the diplomatic relations of the trading city-states with the Targaryen family. Viserys does not know whether Asher Greyjoy can do well. He once intended to let Littlefinger accompany him, but after thinking it over, he gave up the idea. Just by putting Petty Baelish and Asher Greyjoy together, it is clear that the two will not get along. Asher is as fiery as fire, and she can't tolerate sand in her eyes, while Littlefinger is full of conspiracies and tricks. If the two work together, I'm afraid that Asher will kill the governor of the Vale with a knife, or Littlefinger will make Asher die in a foreign land through calculation. Moreover, the governor of the Vale's main task at present is to deepen the development and control of the Vale. The Targaryen family does not have a strong grasp of the Vale, because the soldiers of the Targaryen family have not conquered this land personally. Although the Petty family was born in the Vale, their influence was also very small and almost non-existent. Now they still need to rely on the help of the traditional nobles of the Vale to pass on their orders. The Vale is the most incompletely reformed area now. There are many reasons. One is because of the war. There was no killing. The second is the land. There are many deep mountains and old forests in the Vale. Many villages in the mountains cannot be found by anyone except locals or local nobles. Of course, this lack of influence does not mean that the nobles of the Vale will rebel. They do not have the courage yet. They still need to be trembling in the face of the Iron Throne's orders. However, Littlefinger himself, the governor of the Vale who relied on selling out his master for glory, needs to spend more effort to rule this land. The Royal Council officially notified Miraz, the envoy of the Nath people, and told him that the Iron Throne decided to send a fleet of 2,000 people to Nath Island. They will be stationed on the islands near Nath Island to protect the Nath people from attacks by pirates and slave catchers. The Nath people were naturally ecstatic. They were originally worried because their cousins had a fight with a prince named Joffrey Waters half a month ago. Although Miraz learned the common language when he was a slave, he did not understand the situation in Westeros, and he did not understand what kind of identity this Joffrey was. But the final result seemed to be that Joffrey was punished for offending the princess, and his mother Cersei was also held jointly responsible and was accused of lax discipline. Thank you for your help, Your Majesty. In the study of Meagher's Holdfast, Viserys told Miraz that the Iron Throne decided to send troops to Nath Island. The messenger of the Nath people immediately had tears in his eyes and wanted to kneel down to Viserys, but was rejected by Viserys with a wave of his hand. Chapter 630, Statue. Of course, the people of Nath did not know that the Iron Throne had only sent an armed delegation under the pretext of sending troops to Nath Island, extending the kingdom's hand to the other side of the Narrow Sea and even to the Summer Sea, Slavers Bay, the Basilisk Islands, the continent of Sothoryos, and other places. The Targaryen fleet first established a base there, established connections with these indigenous kingdoms and tribes, and then expanded the country's influence to prepare for subsequent trade, minerals, exchanges, wars, etc. Then Viserys remembered something and asked Miraz, "By the way, I heard from Dany that your sister Missandei wants to stay in King's Landing?" Viserys remembered what Daenerys had said to him not long ago. Missandei wanted to stay in King's Landing, and even wanted to study in the academy. This is a child with a high talent for learning. Her golden eyes are full of desire for knowledge, and she has even overcome the fear of a foreign country. And Missandei needs to get the consent of her cousin if she wants to stay in King's Landing. Missandei herself dare not tell her cousin, so she can only go to her best friend Daenerys. However, the silver-haired girl also had no way to give orders to Missandei's cousin, so she ran to Viserys for help. She hoped that Viserys could persuade Miraz to keep the girl in Westeros. Since the conflict between the Nathi child and Joffrey half a month ago, Daenerys and Missandei, the destined best friends, have magically come together again. Daenerys has never had any playmates in the Red Castle. Rhaenys has grown up, but she has not yet held her adulthood ceremony. In addition, Her Royal Highness, the Duke and Princess of Summerhall, is busy with various government affairs every day. She has begun to share responsibilities for Viserys and naturally has no time to play with Daenerys. On the other hand, Sansa, who is about the same age as her, is too shy. Although the two are good friends, they are not inseparable. And Missandei appeared at the right time. Although this little girl from Arth is a few years younger than Dany, the two of them are surprisingly very compatible. Your Majesty. Hearing this question suddenly asked by Viserys, the Nath envoy, who was wearing a grey and white robe that half exposed his chest, smiled bitterly. Missandei had mentioned it to him several times during this period. She wanted to stay in King's Landing to learn advanced knowledge, and then go back to benefit her hometown. However, Miraz really couldn't bear to leave his cousin alone in King's Landing, because he would go home regardless of whether reinforcement were brought in or not. The Nath people have a very strong desire to return home. But now that Viserys has proposed it, Miraz has no way to refute Viserys' face, so he could only smile bitterly and agree. If she wants to stay, let her stay here. Her Royal Highness likes her, and it is her blessing to let her be Her Royal Highness's maid. Hearing that her cousin had agreed, Missandei, who was eavesdropping outside the door, cheered and jumped for joy, and her beautiful and pure golden eyes under her slightly dark skin were shining with joy. It turned out that Missandei and Daenerys had been eavesdropping here for a long time, since early in the morning. Miraz in the study was startled. Eavesdropping on the king's conversation is a serious crime. However, Viserys just smiled and shook his head helplessly. In fact, he had known that the two girls were eavesdropping outside the door, and even knew that it was Daenerys who sent his servant Robb away. However, although the matter of sending troops to North Island has been set in stone, it is still not possible to set sail in the short term. It took half a month to decide the route and main tasks of this voyage. The ministers of the Royal Council discussed every day which route should be taken. Should they visit Tyrosh first, or Lies, and then turn back to visit Tyrosh? And how long should each city-state stay? And what Asha Greyjoy needs to pay attention to during the period must be clearly defined in advance, and cannot be completely relied on the spot. At the same time, the most important thing is Viserys' handwritten letter. The king's handwritten letter is related to the country's diplomacy, so what Viserys should write, what words to use, what attitude to express, what to say, and what not to say, all of these need to be prepared in advance. And this task was mainly given to Tyrion, and the little devil spent a lot of time thinking about these letters. This is the finalization of the preparations for this action, but when the action really begins, there are more things to be busy with. As the commander of the expedition fleet, Asha Greyjoy needs to personally select soldiers and prepare supplies for this long journey, and contact these city-states to be visited in advance to avoid misunderstandings. If the other party mistakenly thinks that they are going to attack the trading city-states, it will be a big mistake. These preparations may take more than a month, which is bad news for Miraz, who is anxious to go home, but it is good news for Missandei, who has not had time to say goodbye. Her other two brothers, Missandei and Missandei, will also return together. She has at least 1 month to regret it. Night. The Red Castle is quiet at night, and only the patrolling Unsullied soldiers are patrolling around with lanterns. More than half a year ago, a masked gangster sneaked into the Red Castle, seemingly attempting to steal, and killed 2 Unsullied soldiers, but was then besieged by more Unsullied. The gangster then escaped from the Red Castle, and the Unsullied soldiers chased him out, and finally found his body in a corner not far from the Red Castle. The other party had several wounds on his body, and was still warm, and was dressed the same as the gangster. Although this kind of thing is rare, it is not impossible to happen. After all, the Red Castle is the royal palace of Westeros, and there are many people who choose to take risks when they are desperate. Therefore, after this incident, the Unsullied commander Black Worm stepped up patrols in the castle, from a group of 2 to a group of 5, and the area near the Red Castle was also designated as a restricted area, and no one was allowed to approach. At this moment, in the Godswood behind the Red Castle, Viserys did not stay in the king's bedroom and Meagher's tower to rest, but sat quietly among a fallen leaf. A ball of fire burned in his palm. This ball of fire was the golden fire of nothingness that had suddenly started burning a few months ago. However, after a few months, it had grown a little bit from the small flame at the beginning, but the progress was extremely slow. Viserys stared at the ball of fire and his heart suddenly tightened slightly, but his hands did not stop moving. He watched it merge with the nameless statue he had seized from Gian. The next second, the golden light in the sacred forest was very strong. Chapter 631 Fusion. What happened? Upstairs in Miga's house, Irian was sitting on a feather bed chatting with her cousin Rines, and suddenly she noticed that golden light was shining into the room from the outside. The Queen of Westeros, holding her skirt in her hand, hurried to the window with the eldest princess of the dynasty, overlooking the golden light coming out of the godswood below, which was like the scorching sun. Sansa. Then Irian called her maid and asked her to quickly notify the unsullied soldiers to go and investigate the situation. The loyal guards of the Red Castle naturally did not need the Queen's orders, and they even reacted faster than Irian. When the golden light shot up into the sky, the unsullied soldiers patrolling around formed a shield formation and quickly surrounded the godswood. Quick, quick, quick. Hurry, hurry. The unsullied soldiers surrounded the godswood in full battle array and faced the unknown golden light that shot up into the sky without fear, and then raised their shields and gathered towards the source of the central golden light. The godswood of the Red Keep contains elms, alders, and poplars. It is located behind the Red Keep and overlooks the Blackwater estuary. The heart tree in the godswood is a huge oak with smokeberry vines growing on its branches, now shining in the golden light. The unsullied soldiers made a sound as they stepped on the fallen leaves in the godswood, and the golden flames that were getting closer and closer also illuminated the faces of all the soldiers. The closer they got, the clearer they could see that there seemed to be a looming figure in the golden flames. The eyes of the unsullied soldiers were firm, but when they saw a figure in the flames, they couldn't help but roll their throats slightly and clenched their spears and shields. This was beyond their cognitive limits and reached the level of inhumanity. They didn't know what kind of enemy they were facing. Who? Then a soldier couldn't help but ask in a sharp voice in Valyrian. However, the figure sitting cross-legged in the golden flames seemed to wake up at this time. He raised his head slightly, realizing the big commotion he had caused. I'm afraid that tomorrow, not only the Red Keep, but the entire King's Landing will have something to discuss. Back off. Don't let anyone get close. A familiar voice came from the golden flames. The unsullied soldiers who were surrounding the godswood were slightly stunned when they heard the voice, but then they realized who the owner of the flames was. Now it seems that there is no one in the Seven Kingdoms who can bathe in the flames without being hurt. Yes, your majesty. Crash. In an instant, all the unsullied soldiers surrounding the godswood knelt on one knee, then hurriedly retreated and surrounded the entire godswood, prohibiting anyone from approaching. Even the women such as Irian and Rines who arrived later wanted to go in and take a look, but were refused. The first standard for the unsullied to execute orders is Viserys' words. When anyone else conflicts with Viserys' orders, the unsullied will implement the first standard. In the godswood, without being disturbed by others, Viserys' eyes were all on the nameless statue in his hand. This is one of the treasures left by Gillian Lannister. Gillian once explored the ruins of Valyria and became one of the few people who came out alive. Gillian has many secrets, including that he lurked beside Viserys and was eventually exposed and committed suicide by taking poison, and his body disappeared without a trace. Viserys initially thought that Tywin sent someone to steal the body, but according to the information now known, the tomb that Tywin set for his brother was just a cenotaph, and there was no body of Gillian in it. No one knows how Gillian's body grew legs and ran away. However, this nameless statue with horns on its head was accidentally touched by Viserys when he was looking through his private storehouse not long ago, and it actually gave rise to a hidden special power. This special power seduced a certain characteristic in his body, allowing Viserys to successfully notice it. This feeling made Viserys feel a little strange, because he had never had such a reaction before. This statue that was bought from the ruins of Valyria seemed to want some kind of power from his body, and this power was the golden flame of nothingness that had inexplicably burned in his body not long ago. However, Viserys was not panicked by this inexplicable situation, but fell into deep thought. However, he did not rush to merge the golden flame with this nameless statue immediately, or smash the statue and throw it away because of fear. Then Viserys experimented with all the things in the warehouse one by one, and finally found another thing, which was also very interested in the golden flame in Viserys' body, and showed a strong attraction. It was like a greedy child who encountered a delicious cake, and it was instinct that was at work. This is a huge raven skull that Viserys found in an unnamed cave in the Stormlands before the Battle of Bronzegate. According to the memory of the three-eyed raven, he once flew here with his sword, the Dark Sister, and inserted this sword into the huge pale raven skull to suppress the opponent. Valyrian steel seems to have a strong effect of suppressing magic. After the Dark Sister inserted it, the white raven head stopped vibrating, and the unprecedented huge storm on the narrow sea slowly stopped. Daenerys was born in this storm. Viserys took the Dark Sister away before the Battle of Bronzegate, and also took this huge pale raven skull. From that time on, he felt a little bit of the inexplicable power contained in the skull. According to the documents he found, the only person associated with Raven and Storm seems to be the legendary Storm God, who is a god that appeared in the Ironborn religion. The Storm God is the eternal enemy of the drowned god. He lives in a hall in the clouds, and the ravens are his servants. He sets traps to lure the Ironborn to their own destruction. There are ancient rumors that the Storm God's servants are ravens, and there are rumors that the Storm God himself is a raven. Viserys thought this head was extraordinary, and he had asked Melisandre, Dr. Marwyn the wizard, and others to study it, but they could not explain it, so the raven head has been pressed under his warehouse. However, the other party is now also interested in the golden flame burning in his body. Viserys placed the nameless statue unearthed from the ruins of Illyria and the huge pale raven skull together. After some consideration, Viserys finally chose to pick up the nameless statue. Chapter 632 Miracle. Viserys chose the statue in this choice, which was a result of his careful consideration. There are many reasons for him to do so. One of them is that this nameless statue comes from the ancient Valyrian ruins. The most mysterious black fog in Viserys' body can be traced back to the Valyrian ruins, and even its manifestation is expressed in High Valyrian. This shows that there are countless connections between the two sides. The last time the grey fog in the Valyrian ruins rioted, this nameless statue also dissipated the grey fog. The second reason is that according to Viserys' observation, the power of this nameless statue seduced by the golden flame in his body is relatively weaker, not as strong as the white raven skull. There is a certain mysterious quality hidden in the nameless statue and the white raven skull, and Viserys does not know how to describe this quality. It is called divine power or divinity, which is the upgraded version of human consciousness or power that transcends the mundane. They had hidden themselves very well. Even though Viserys had scanned them over and over again with his supermental power, he could not detect any clues from them. However, until the mysterious golden flame ignited on Viserys' body, the divinity hidden in the white crow skull and the nameless statue was suddenly seduced out. They all longed for Viserys' power, and Viserys felt helpless about the inexplicable golden flame burning in his body, because the other party existed completely in nothingness, could not burn, and could not be touched. Even if he put the flame in front of the branch, he could not ignite it. Now that these two mysterious things are so eager to get it, it is not difficult for Viserys to guess that when the two objects really come into contact and merge together, some magical changes will definitely occur. Of course, whether this change is developing in a good direction or a bad direction, he is not sure now. But one thing is certain, if he does nothing, he will definitely not be able to seek a breakthrough. Therefore, Viserys thought about it again and again, and chose to let one of the things fuse with the golden flame, to try it out first. If the result is good, everything will be fine. If the result is bad, if there is a problem, just solve it. The most important thing is to figure out what the golden flame is. The nameless statue, which contains relatively less divinity, became the best experimental subject. Viserys even left Meagher's holdfast, the royal bedroom, and came to the godswood behind the Red Castle, where few people passed by, for fear that some uncontrollable situations would occur and hurt his family, wife, and children. However, the reality was in front of him, and Viserys' worries and caution were not unreasonable. Even though he had chosen the one with relatively less divinity among the two things, uncontrollable situations still occurred. But now he could no longer stop, and could only try his best to fuse the golden flame and the nameless statue together. Come again. The young man with silver gold long hair sat cross-legged in the center of the godswood, biting his teeth slightly on his handsome cheek, and his pair of violet eyes were full of determination. In the godwood, the golden flames of nothingness enveloped the whole body of the silver-haired young man. The golden light passed through the branches and leaves above his head, penetrated the dark clouds above his head, and went straight to the sky. The golden light column rose from Egan's High Hill and the Red Castle, reaching the sky and the earth. Even though many people had fallen asleep at night, King's Landing, as the capital of Westeros, had a rich nightlife, and was naturally very lively. There were many people in King's Landing, drunken mercenaries, golden robes standing guard, princes and nobles from all over the 7 kingdoms, and merchants. Now they all put down their work, and stared at the magical scene from the Red Castle on Egan's High Hill. This is, in the center of King's Landing, Melisandre, the vice president of the seminary, stood on the top of the tower, staring at the golden fire in a daze, fearful, panicked, and at the same time, a pair of eyes revealed a deep puzzlement. Miss, come out and see. On the other side, in a property belonging to the Tyrell family in Star Shuttle City, little Rose Marguerite Tyrell was just about to go to sleep, but was awakened by her maid. Although Marguerite was slightly dissatisfied, she always remembered her grandmother's teachings. As a noble lady, she should not lose her temper like a shrew, and should learn to control her emotions. Then the brown curly-haired girl in pajamas took a deep breath and tried to show a sweet smile on her face. What's wrong? Yalan. I'll go out and see. However, Marguerite's words were choked in her throat halfway through. She stood there in a daze, staring at the golden light rising into the sky in the distance with wide eyes, her face full of disbelief. This magical scene is almost a miracle in the eyes of mortals. Miss Marguerite Tyrell's mind was blank, and her mouth opened slightly. At this moment, there was only one idea in her mind, and she murmured, "Gods above." Then, as if she had realized something, she shuddered. This is the 7 gods appearing. Quick, Alan. Let's make a wish. If we make a wish now, the 7 gods will definitely help us realize it. Marguerite's words were like a wake-up call. Her best friend and maid, Arlen Tyrell, also shuddered slightly, and then suddenly understood. Yes, Mrs. Right. This is the 7 gods appearing. Let's make a wish. Then, Marguerite and Arlen, 2 girls from the Tyrell family, made a serious wish towards the golden light rising from Egan's High Hill. They closed their eyes slightly, made a prayer gesture, pointed their fingers at their brows, and their faces were more pious than ever before. May the 7 gods bless me. My wish is to become the queen of His Majesty the King. Although this may have taken away Marguerite's wish, but, Your Majesty is so handsome. Marguerite's maid Arlen Tyrell closed her eyes, and then imagined herself becoming the queen, and even couldn't help but tremble with excitement. On the other side, the beautiful little girl from the Rose family with brown curly hair and a delicate face, was also making a wish seriously. May the gods bless me. I hope I can become a queen who is high above. The 2 girls began to make wishes at the same time, and then opened their eyes at the same time, looking at the golden light column that was gradually dissipating in the distance, and then smiled at each other. Chapter 633 Merixes. Far away in Egan's High Hill, in the godswood behind the Red Keep, the golden pillar of light that was regarded as a miracle by countless people, and was worth discussing for a long time, slowly dissipated, and turned into golden spots scattered in the air. The unsullied soldiers were still on high alert, holding spears and shields, to form a circle, to protect the godswood in the center, with cold eyes, prohibiting anyone from entering the godswood. Queen Irian, Princess Rhaenys, Daenerys and others were waiting anxiously outside the woods, wondering how Viserys was doing now. Sorry, my lord. Oberyn and other important officials of the Royal Council also rushed to the scene, but were still turned away by the black bugs. The commander of the Unsullied army had a stern face, and didn't give anyone face. He didn't even let the queen and the princess in, let alone Oberyn and others. Oberyn, Illyrio, Varys and other important officials of the Royal Council had no choice but to wait outside. In the godswood, the golden light slowly dissipated, and Viserys was still sitting there, holding the faceless statue in his hand, his face calm and slightly thoughtful. Too long at this moment, a woman's sigh suddenly appeared in Viserys' mind, making his eyes slightly condense. Who are you? The unsullied soldiers outside surrounded the godswood, and Viserys sat in the godswood with a serious look. Because he traced the voice that suddenly appeared in his mind. It came from the statue of the faceless goddess in his hand. A talking stone. This must involve one of the most mysterious powers in the world, and Viserys is already the strongest among humans. In other words, if something really happened, no one could protect Viserys, not even the unsullied outside, or the 100,000 troops. However, Viserys was still very calm. It was not that he was so conceited about his own strength, but that he had already prepared himself mentally in advance. After everything just now was over, there would definitely be some changes that he had never seen before. My name is Merixes. The voice from the faceless idol once again rang in Viserys' mind. This time, Viserys heard clearly that the other party was speaking High Valyrian, but it was slightly different from the Valyrian he usually spoke. The other party's words sounded like a variant of the Valyrian dialect, with a strange tongue roll and a slightly strange tone, but if Viserys listened carefully, he could hear what the other party was saying. Viserys was not very unfamiliar with this language, because it was the ancient Valyrian language that the current Grand Maester Dr. Marwyn had been studying. Human languages are always changing, and hundreds or thousands of years are enough to produce significant changes. Ancient Valyrian. Your name is Merixes. The young man with silver gold hair was still sitting on the ground, and his pair of violet eyes showed a slight hesitation. Are you? Because of the black mist in his body, Viserys was quite interested in the history of the destroyed Valyrian freehold. However, this ancient and great empire has been destroyed, and its glorious history seems to have been wiped out by an invisible hand. Otherwise, there is no way to explain that after the powerful empire that once ruled the world encountered a world-destroying disaster, no one can remember their history, and even the names of the 40 families that ruled Valyria cannot be remembered. When Valyria was at its most glorious, from Dragonstone to the land of the ancient Gis Empire, from the Summer Islands to the Grasslands, they left behind so many descendants, exquisite cities and magnificent buildings, but no one remembers their history. Is this realistic? But unfortunately, this is a reality. It has been less than 1,000 years since Valyria was destroyed, but Viserys has found it difficult to collect too detailed information about them. There are even scholars such as Dr. Marwyn who specialize in research, looking for clues from these little clues to explore the truth. Merixes. Viserys has heard of this name. However, this was not the third of the 5 young dragons, the dark blue female dragon, or the female dragon ridden by Aegon the Conqueror's sister Rhaenys, but the real ancient god Merixes believed in by the Valyrians. The dragon of Aegon the Conqueror's sister was named after this ancient goddess, and Viserys also used this method when naming the young dragon. I'm the lord of the raging ocean. Then a low, majestic, and oppressive voice repeatedly vibrated in his mind, confirming his guess. Although the faceless goddess statue was a graceful woman, the other party was the sea god in the Valyrian legend. Since she was a true god, she was definitely not a high-level prostitute that people wanted to be with. However, the woman's voice was full of majesty and oppression, but it did not scare Viserys. After all, the other party was still in his palm. If this true god of Valyria really still had 1/10 of the strength in his heyday, perhaps he would not have fallen to such a state. Any god with a little dignity would not be held in the hands of mortals. Tell me, what exactly is this statue? And why have you fallen to such a state? Viserys asked calmly, and the other party was indeed silent after hearing this, and spoke after a long while. In any case, the premise of communication between the two parties should be to know the identity of the other party. Viserys knew her name, but Merixes, who called himself the Lord of the Raging Ocean, did not know who this silver-haired young man was. My name is Viserys Targaryen, the King of Men. Viserys did not hide anything after hearing this, but introduced himself concisely. For an ancient god like Merixes, it seems that she has been sleeping for an unknown period of time. Viserys has just woken her up. Instead of telling her that he is the Lord of the 7 Kingdoms of Westeros, which requires a lot of effort to explain, it is better to tell her directly that he is a human king. As expected, Viserys' words made Merixes understand immediately, but she was more interested in Viserys' last name. Merixes could feel the power of Valyria's oldest sacred bloodline from the body of the silver-haired young man in front of her, but she didn't expect Viserys to come from the weak Targaryen family. And now he has become the so-called human king? If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 634 Fire of Faith. You are from Targaryen. Merixes was silent for a long time and seemed to organize her words before speaking. I'm not Merixes either. The woman's words made Viserys frown slightly. She said she was Merixes for a while, and then she said she was not. What was going on? I'm just a little regret of her. I don't know whether she is dead or alive now. But then the other party also explained happily. It turned out that during the Doomsday, the Valyrian continent was torn apart, volcanoes erupted, floods, earthquakes, fire rained from the sky, and thick smoke covered the entire continent. The Valyrian city was also reduced to ruins, and the people died and were injured. Even the dragons and the descendants of the noble dragon family could not escape the nightmare. They rode on the dragons and tried to escape in a hurry, but none of them succeeded. This continent seemed to be cursed by the gods. Except for the Targaryen family on Dragonstone, all other noble dragon families were destroyed. The gods of Valyria, including Balerion, the god of death, Vagar, the lord of lava and fire, Terex, the god of the sun, and Merix, the lord of the ocean, all disappeared. Without the gods of Valyria to save the world, they watched the entire continent fall and became the devil's land cursed by the gods. The woman in the statue of Merixes is a remnant of Merixes, the lord of the ocean. She feeds on people's faith, and the power of faith is also one of the main sources of power for the gods. Every statue or object of trust of the ancient gods has the remnant of this god, which is used to help the gods collect the power of faith and respond to the prayers of their believers. Unless the ancient god himself has died, with the passage of time, these remnants will all dissipate, and the prayers of the believers will lose their effect and gradually disappear from this world. When the Doomsday collapsed, she sensed that in the magnificent temple of the ancient gods of Valyria, the statues of Merixes collapsed one by one, and the remnants of the goddess attached to them were wiped out. The remnant in front of her was too weak, and luckily it was not shattered by the terrible power that enveloped the entire continent, so it escaped. Then, in order to protect itself, the remnant of Merixes tried to prolong its life, and fell asleep, until it was awakened by Viserys. However, now, she can no longer sense any breath of the same origin from this world. She can't sense the real body of Merixes, the lord of the sea and the raging waves, nor can she sense the remnants of the other Merixes. She seems to have become the only existence alone. Is that so? Viserys listened to what Merixes said, and his eyes showed surprise. Everything about the ruins of Valyria seemed to be covered with a thick fog, just like the sea of smoke covering the ruins. However, this Merixes was a witness and survivor of the Doomsday disaster. All the truth came out of her mouth as easily as flowing water. Many of Viserys' doubts were instantly solved, but the more he knew, the more puzzles he had. The more he listened to Merixes, and the dragon dream he had before, the more he felt that the Doomsday disaster of Valyria was not a natural disaster, but a man-made disaster. Who exactly attacked the great human empire of Valyria? According to Merixes, Valyria has many ancient gods, each of whom is powerful, who can easily restrict or even kill them, making them unable to save the collapse of the empire. Who is Valyria's enemy? However, Viserys couldn't help but raise his inner doubts, but unfortunately, the remnant of Merixes couldn't give an answer. She was just a remnant of the statue in the temple of the small castle, not Merixes herself. She didn't know who Valyria's enemy was, who suppressed or killed Merixes. Viserys knew that he was a little too hasty when he heard it. It was really too difficult to expect the other party's remnant to explain the biggest secret of the world. But Viserys was not discouraged. He knew the fate between him and the ruins of Valyria, and sooner or later he would have to explore this mysterious lost continent again. Therefore, he made a request to the remnant of Merixes, hoping that the other party could help answer some questions, and the remnant of Merixes also readily agreed. After all, now she still has to rely on the flame in Viserys' body to survive. Losing this golden flame, she must choose to sleep again, in order to survive longer, but this time it will be even more difficult to get the chance to be awakened. After all, lighting this golden flame is something that only one person has been able to do in the past 1,000 years. However, the remnant of Meraces also told Viserys in advance that she didn't know much, and if she could answer, she would definitely try her best to help, but she needed the golden flame in Viserys' body to help her maintain life. And Viserys naturally nodded and agreed. Then what should I call you from now on? Viserys' question made the remnant of Meraces silent for a moment, and then spoke with a little sadness. Just call me Meraces. I'm the only remnant of her in the whole world, so I'm Meraces. Okay. Viserys nodded slightly, and then changed the subject, thinking of the request that Meraces had just made, wanting to use the golden flame in his body to prolong his life. In fact, he chose to take the risk of doing this experiment, just to figure out the flame. He didn't expect to awaken the remnant of Meraces from a faceless statue. Meraces, what is the golden flame in my body? Since the cooperation between the two sides has begun, Viserys asked openly. The fire of faith. Meraces really fulfilled his obligation to cooperate, and explained without any hesitation. You have won the faith of your people. This is the foundation of the road to becoming a god, and it is also the first step. There are many gods of all sizes in this world. Most of them are leaders of nations or countries or some kind of spiritual sustenance. As long as you have faith, you can produce characteristics. This is the same as Viserys' speculation about the mysterious characteristics in the statue and the white crow skull not long ago, but Viserys named it divinity, while Meraces called it faith. Chapter 635 Migration of Population. The sudden appearance of golden light above the Red Keep could not be concealed. Many people witnessed this scene that night, which lasted for a quarter of an hour. Then this incident became the topic of conversation among the people of King's Landing. Some people claimed that the treasure left by the conqueror was found under the Red Keep, and as long as they got it, they could control the dragon. Others believed that this was the appearance of the seven gods, just like the legendary story of the seven gods crowning his majesty when he was on the other side of the narrow sea. The rumor that Viserys would be crowned as emperor was once again accompanied by rumors. However, this time the miracle was much smaller than the previous scene of the red comet passing through the sky. It was only within the scope of King's Landing and Blackwater Bay. Many merchants traveling to King's Landing also witnessed it with their own eyes, and then it gradually spread with the passage of time. The miracle of the golden light appeared behind the Red Keep on Aegon's High Hill, so all the rumors eventually pointed to Viserys alone. The rumor that his majesty possessed magic had actually set off a wave of enthusiasm in King's Landing a long time ago. Rumors were rampant in the streets, and intelligence personnel from other forces squatting in King's Landing also collected all the news and sent them to their respective masters. And Viserys' image became more mysterious and unfathomable in the spread of these news and rumors. People with ulterior motives would subconsciously lower their voices when mentioning his name, and even couldn't help looking southeast, fearing that he could hear their conversation with magic on the distant Aegon Hill. However, Viserys actually did not have such ability, and even if he had such ability, he would be too lazy to monitor the entire city. Otherwise he would probably be annoyed to death. When he did his job well, and did not make mistakes, he would solve problems when problems arose. This is his usual style. A few days ago, the miracle was widely spread in King's Landing, and the unsullied soldiers in the Red Castle, the maids and servants in the palace, and the important officials of the Royal Council were witnessed up close. The source of this golden light was Viserys. There was no so-called seven gods, this god or that god, only their majesty was there. It was just unknown what he was doing in the Godswood to make such a commotion, and he ordered the unsullied soldiers to impose martial law around and prohibit anyone from approaching. Therefore, during this period of time, the important officials of the Iron Throne Council were all very secretive in the face of inquiries from all sides, just shook their heads, and dared not talk more. The closer they were to Viserys, the deeper their awe from the heart became. The unsullied soldiers who first entered the Godswood should have seen something, but the unsullied were more tight-lipped, and no one could let them say what they saw. Therefore, the matter of miracles became a taboo topic among the powerful and noble class in King's Landing. The Night's Watch has broken through the moat Kaelin and recaptured White Harbor by water. Now they are splitting into two groups, one to take Barrowton and the other to Hornwood. The fleet seems to intend to go up the White Knife and take Severn and Winterfell. This is too risky. Yes, your majesty. So they should have given up this plan and continue to advance slowly. In the Royal Council Hall of the Red Keep, the king and his ministers were discussing the war in the north, but few people noticed that there was a statue of a woman with horns on her head and unclear cheeks on a table in the Royal Council Hall. The war to recapture the north was carried out in an orderly manner. As humans had previously speculated, the White Walkers did not choose to resist fiercely, but disappeared without a trace. Only the scattered dead army on this land was resisting the offensive of the Night's Watch. But it is obvious that these dead army were very brave when they were led by the White Walkers and united, but now the scattered soldiers did not form a difficult obstacle to the advancement of the army. The Legion was still heading north one step at a time. What about the Three Sisters? Then Viserys looked at the map and thought of another question. He found that he seemed to have overlooked these three small islands, perhaps because they were too small. Well, forgive me for being blunt, your majesty. As the Minister of Intelligence, Varys crossed his hands in his sleeves and hesitated for a moment before speaking. The Three Sisters have long been deserted. Huh? Why? Did the Three Sisters also encounter attacks by the White Walkers? Viserys was slightly startled, and Varys shook his head and explained. No, your majesty. The Three Sisters did not encounter attacks by the White Walkers like the Iron Islands. But the people living on these islands were affected by the fall of White Harbor and had already fled. There are many factors, including fear and terror, and the fall of White Harbor. The entire north has turned into hell, and no caravan dared to move north, so the supply to the Three Sisters was cut off. Without warm fur clothing, kerosene, or even candles and food, the people of the Three Sisters Islands had naturally fled for survival. These were things that the masters in King's Landing had never considered, but for ordinary people, they were real livelihood issues. In fact, the Sunderland family of the Three Sisters Islands had previously pledged allegiance to the Arryn family in name, and now they have become nobles and Lord Baelish. Marquis Tristan Sunderland once asked Lord Baelish for help, hoping that the governor of the valley could relocate some of the refugees to the Three Sisters Islands. Now there is only the Sunderland family on such a large island. Speaking of this topic, the important officials of the Royal Council present couldn't help laughing. However, Lord Petty seemed to want to attack the other party, claiming that the Three Sisters Islands were fickle and the Sunderland family was as greedy and evil as wild beasts, and refuted the other party's request. If the Sunderland family wants to obtain refugees, they must bow to the Eyrie, instead of just following orders and not listening to announcements as before. The bald eunuch planted little birds in the Eyrie, and even restored Littlefinger's words word for word. Lord Euron Greyjoy of the Iron Islands once made this request, hoping to migrate some people from the Westerlands to the Iron Islands. But it was also rejected by Lord Mystoyne, the Earl of Casterly Rock. Not every place is like King's Landing, and population also means wealth, your majesty. Varys' little birds are all over the Seven Kingdoms, even including the trading city-states. Perhaps the existence of Ramsay Snow made the octopus spider feel a sense of crisis. Chapter 636, Dawn Conflict. Lord Varys was once the most irreplaceable person in King's Landing, otherwise he would not have served three kings. However, now that Viserys has set up an internal inspection agency, Varys realized that he is not irreplaceable. The fiercest battle between Little Bad and the Ministry of Internal Affairs has even escalated to the point where 2 or 3 people die every day. Viserys is well aware of this situation, but he did not interfere directly. In addition to being more cautious, Varys also dared not hide any intelligence. His best method was to selectively report the intelligence he received. However, now that there is a competitor, Varys' tricks have become ineffective. Oh. Mystoyne rejected Euron. So what will happen next? It is impossible that there will be no one in the Iron Islands forever. Where does Euron want to find people? Nothing more than launching wars and capturing slaves. You know, Lord Euron now has the military position of a naval commander, and the Iron Fleet is still commanded by him. Varys shook his shiny head and said, he might go and plunder some islands in the Sunset Sea. It is said that those barbarians are also descendants of the Ironborn. The routine royal council ended quickly. Many important ministers who participated in the royal council left in groups, talking and laughing, but one person left and returned. Lord Alistair Florent, I have other things to do. I will take my leave first. Varys bowed slightly to the tall and thin old man who was the Minister of Agriculture, and then walked away in small steps. Spiders are often annoying. On the other side, Tyrion, who was chatting and laughing with a Barin, spoke to Alistair. Oh, Lord Tyrion. Alistair Florent heard the little devil's words, and stood there with a polite smile, nodding and greeting the two. Although he has been in the royal council for a long time, he is still a newcomer in the workplace compared to these people. If the old man wants to stay in the royal council for a long time, he needs to build good relationships with these old predecessors. The most important thing is that the backers behind Alistair are not very strong. His Minister of Agriculture is just the product of political compromise. However, a Baron ignored the old man's goodwill, just glanced at the back of the octopus spider leaving, and frowned slightly. He always felt that there was something else in the look in Varys' eyes today, and then he felt an inexplicable chill. Is this eunuch? On the other side, Viserys was returning to Meagher's tower accompanied by his squire Robb Stark. Robb, what did you learn today? The two walked down the steps and talked. As his squire, Robb also followed Viserys to learn governance and martial arts. This is the rule for nobles, to send squires to each other, which is considered a way of apprenticeship. Therefore, sometimes when Viserys convened the royal council, he would let Robb listen in or guard the door outside. When necessary, Viserys would personally appoint Robb as a knight. I have learned the importance of population, Your Majesty. It turns out that population is so important. The young man with reddish brown hair thought for a while with his hand on the hilt of the sword, and then spoke. He had never thought about the importance of population before, and fell into a misconception of thinking. He even thought that these commoners were a burden to the nobles. They had to work hard to protect the people under their rule. This was the honor and responsibility of the nobles, but now it seems to be the opposite. The luxurious life of the nobles was all built up bit by the common people he mentioned. Well, what else? Viserys did not comment on Robb's words, but just nodded slightly and spoke. At this time, he met Varys, who quietly returned at the corner of the corridor. Varys? Your Majesty, Dorne. There is one more thing I want to report to you about Dorne. Prince Oberyn of Dorne was present just now, so Varys did not mention this matter in person. Instead, he waited until the royal council was adjourned, and quietly came back to find Viserys to talk about this matter alone. Oh. In the study of Meagher's holdfast, Viserys listened to what Varys said, crossed his hands on the table, and showed a thoughtful look on his face. There is such a thing. But in fact, Viserys had expected this to happen. It was just a matter of time, just like a bomb buried in the corner. If you don't pay attention to it for years, it will explode one day. It's just that he didn't expect that this bomb in Dorne would explode at this critical moment. According to Varys' report, there were some conflicts between the nobles in the King's territory of the Reach and the nobles of Dorne. The reason was that the Dornish cavalry began to frequently move around the King's territory of the Reach, posing a great threat to the nobles around the border. In fact, the two sides were originally feuds, and the hatred could not be resolved by a short period of peace. Some of the fathers and grandfathers of both sides died at the hands of the other side. Now the nobles of the Reach have no soldiers, so they naturally have a strong sense of crisis. They hugged each other in advance and everyone was in danger. However, at this moment, it was a group of Dorne cavalrymen who ignited the gunpowder barrel. They rushed into a noble fiefdom of the King of the River Reach, burned a village on the fiefdom, and killed all the villagers. In fact, this kind of thing is not uncommon in the past. Dorne cavalrymen sent people to burn the villages of the Border nobles, and the Border nobles also fought back. However, this time, the Dorne cavalry seemed to bully the Border nobles because they had no military power and went deep into the vicinity of the castle to demonstrate, which made the nobles of the castle feel a sense of crisis. This move of the Dorne cavalry instantly detonated the anger of the nobles of the River Reach. Although the military power has been recovered now, the Border nobles still have a large number of private soldiers, and the local people are tough, and it is easy to gather an army. The two sides confronted each other near Night Song City, and even couldn't help but use knives. A knight of the River Reach was killed. Dawn claimed that they were not trying to start a war or invade the king's territory of the Reach, but were hunting down the untouchables who had defected from Dawn, because more and more Dawn people had fled their former homes and came to the king's territory of the Reach in recent times, and some villages were even empty. The Dawn nobles realized it later, but they also felt a sense of crisis, so nobles from all over the country issued a ban to block ports and roads and prohibit leaving the local area. However, this still could not stop the determination of the Dawn people to leave, and even triggered an escape fever, so the Dawn nobles were furious and chose to kill them. They even chased all the way to the Reach to hunt down these defecting untouchables, which triggered this conflict. Chapter 637, Road to Survival. Cullen is a young man from a village near the city of Shianji. He has dark brown hair, bright black eyes, and fair skin, which are very typical features of a stone man. The Dawnishmen living south of the Red Mountains are roughly divided into 3 major groups. Although they are collectively called Dawnishmen, they have detailed divisions. The Salt people live by the sea, mainly in the Broken Arm area near the Red Mountains near the Dawnish Sea. They are soft and dark, with smooth olive skin and long black hair fluttering in the wind. They are mostly fishermen and sailors, and are experienced seafarers who drive the Dawnish fleet. A Baron and the Martel family are typical Salt people. The Sand people live in deserts and narrow river valleys. They are even darker than the Salt people. They are exposed to strong sunlight all day long, and have a brown face. As for the last large group, the Stone people, they live in the mountains and passes on the Red Mountains. They have the best and most beautiful figures among the 3. They are descendants of the Andals and the First Men, with brown or blonde hair. Compared with the rejection of the outside world by the other 2 major ethnic groups, the Stonemen are the most friendly ethnic group among the Dawnish people to the outside world, because their ancestors are also descendants of the Andals and the First Men. But within Dawn, because of this very obvious difference in appearance and culture, the faces of the Stonemen are very similar to their enemies, with almost no difference, so the Stonemen are also the most excluded by the other 2 major ethnic groups within Dawn. And now, the young man Karen in the village near Shianji city is leading the villagers to escape from their hometown, where they have lived for generations, and go to the outside world. However, now all the roads leading to the outside world have been closed by the nobles. This road in Prince's Pass used to be unobstructed, and was the main road to Dawn. It was easier to walk than the Bone Road and there were no steep cliffs. But now Prince's Pass has been strictly checked, and only caravans can enter and exit, and the number of people is also greatly limited. Therefore, Karen, with his mother, brother, and dozens of villagers from Shianji city, can only take great risks to try to cross the Red Mountains to the borderland and even the king's territory of the River Bay. The reason why these Dawnishmen fled their hometown was not too complicated. Naturally, it was because they could not make ends meet. Traditional nobles imposed very high taxes on their fiefdoms. During the war, they even left only one mouthful of food to avoid starvation. But this system has disappeared in other parts of the 7 kingdoms. The days when nobles decided how much taxes to pay are over. Now the tax officials under the Iron Throne go to various places to collect taxes. Taxes are paid according to a certain proportion and are transparent and open. Compared with the previous taxes, they have dropped a lot, and the living standards of the people have also improved significantly. And these are also a chain reaction. When the living standards of the people are improved, even the bandits, bullies, and brotherhoods have become much less. As long as there is no other way out, no one will choose to take risks. The policy changes of the Iron Throne have produced a virtuous circle. But among these changes, Dawn, the only one in the 7 kingdoms that has not changed, seems very abrupt. At first, the Dawnishmen relied on their privileges to be domineering in other parts of the 7 kingdoms. The local noble officials dared not speak out. After all, there was a Dawnish queen behind them. However, with the end of the war, the 7 kingdoms gradually returned to peace, and the privileges of the Dawnishmen gradually became less useful. The capital garrison of King's Landing no longer turned a blind eye to the crimes of the Dawnishmen. After the Dawnish caravans were rampant and offended many of their peers at the beginning, they were also suppressed by other caravans and finally had to flee King's Landing in embarrassment. The gradual loss of privileges is one aspect, but in the end, the Dornishmen even found that they often hit hard against the outside world, but in fact their lives were not as good as the other party wanted. Combined with their previous behavior, they looked like a clown. The living standards of the people in other parts of the Seven Kingdoms are rising, only Dawn is standing still, and even retreating slightly. Moreover, many colleagues who participated in the First and Second Conquest Wars were canonized as knights, property knights, and even lords, because of their military merits. The number of lords in the Seven Kingdoms has exploded. Although most of them cut the large territories into countless small territories and gave them to these meritorious soldiers, they did not have any dissatisfaction. Instead, they were too happy to do so. After all, they had already made the leap to the next level. However, the Dornishmen did not participate in all this, because the king promised the Dornishmen a high degree of self-control. The merits of the Dornishmen should be conferred by their noble lords, and the Iron Throne would not interfere. The Dornish nobles were naturally unwilling to give up their land for fiefdom. In summary, these cumbersome reasons caused the earliest group of Dornishmen to become unbalanced and leave their hometowns, to develop in King's Landing, Gulltown, Lannisport and other places. Later, more Dornishmen also left their hometowns and embarked on the journey north, eventually forming a scale. The population of a large number of villages dropped sharply, which aroused the vigilance of the Dornish nobles, and began to prohibit the people in their territories from leaving. But it was too late. "We will leave alive, right, Karen?" The brown-haired boy's mother, holding her brother in her arms, wrapped in a headscarf and a little disheveled, spoke with a trembling voice. At this moment, they were hiding in the woods of the Red Mountains. The boy Karen was most familiar with the terrain here, so he served as a guide and led the other villagers to escape. Among the remaining dozens of villagers, there were many tall and strong warriors, some of whom had served in the Dawn Army. They were holding homemade spears and swords, and were ready for battle. Hearing his mother's words, the brown-haired boy turned his head and looked at her and his brother in his arms, and then nodded silently. "Yeah, I will." In fact, Karen already regretted running away a little. Although life in Dawn was not very satisfactory, he would not starve to death after all, and this was his hometown. However, now that he had run away, there was no chance to turn back. The village chief discovered that several families had run away and might have reported it to Earl Franklin Fowler. The old Falcon of Shianji City had already issued an order, which spread to the surrounding villages. Anyone who dared to leave his home without permission would be sentenced to death. In other words, once Karen and others fled to Prince's Pass, there was no turning back. Chapter 638 Conflict escalates. The scorching sun overhead, the trees on the Red Mountains were not lush, mostly bare stones, and the ground was barren. Behind them was a desert, and in front of them was an oasis. Walking on the ridge, a group of people could see a tall stone tower on a small hill below the hillside in the distance. "That's the Tower of Joy," the young man, Karen, who was the guide for this trip, introduced. "It is said that Eddard Stark led 6 knights to fight against 3 kings' goods, Gerald Hightower, Arthur Dane, and Oswald Riverrun. What a shameful battle. They were outnumbered," the young man said indignantly. His dream was to be an outstanding swordsman like the Dawn Sword, to travel the world with a sword and uphold honor. However, at this moment, the sound of horse hooves and the voice of stopping came from far behind them. "Stop." A team of Dawn cavalrymen wearing sandy yellow robes and white turbans on their heads were patrolling the mountains near the Tower of Joy. During their patrol, they found this group of traitors who wanted to escape to the north. They immediately drew out the shining scimitars at their waists and rushed over here like an eagle finding its prey. Oh no. Seeing this scene, the dozens of villagers who were preparing to escape were all panicked. Except for a few strong men, most of them were old, weak, and disabled. How could they resist the aggressive cavalry? Fortunately, the Red Mountains had a clear view, and the other side saw them from a distance, but in fact, the two sides were still far apart. "Quick, run." The brown-haired boy Karen's face changed drastically when he saw this scene, and then he hurriedly waved his hand to call everyone to escape to the complex terrain on the other side. There were all rugged rocks and occasional trees there, and it was not easy for the cavalry riding on war horses to catch up. A few days later, on the road leading to Ash Beach, A group of unkempt and ragged Dornish people appeared here. They were the young Karen and his group who escaped from the Red Mountains. They took advantage of the complex terrain of the mountains to deal with the Dornish cavalry and finally escaped from the mountains and even killed several Dornish cavalry. However, the price they paid was that there were only less than 10 villagers left on the road, and the old, weak, sick and disabled died under the knives of their compatriots, including the mother and brother of the young Karen, and in return, the Dornish cavalry became more and more aggressive in their pursuit. Is it worth it? Looking at the less than 10 familiar faces left, Karen's tears flowed unconsciously, and his body couldn't help but tremble slightly. And many people present also lowered their heads and wiped their tears secretly. In fact, many people have regretted it. It is better to live than to die. If they had known this, they would not have chosen this risky road. But unfortunately, no one can sell regret medicine, and everyone must be responsible for their own choices. Rumble. However, when this group of defected Dornish people were resting on the road, the roar of horse hooves came from behind them again. How is it possible? They can't possibly chase us here. They had already reached the reach, but no one could answer his question. All the surviving Dornishmen, including the young Callum, quickly got up and clenched their swords and spears. However, things did not go as planned. At the end of the road leading to Ash Beach, the familiar banner of the Fowler family in Sky City was flying. The Dornish cavalrymen were wrapped in white turbans, wearing sandy yellow battle robes, and riding thin but sturdy desert horses. They chased these traitors for several days and nights, and once lost their way, but finally found them again. Kill them. Then, accompanied by the roar of a Dornish warrior with a falcon emblem on his chest, all the Dornish cavalrymen responded in unison. Rumble. Heavy horse hooves galloped on the road. They stared fiercely at their compatriots, then drew out the bright scimitars at their waists, and rushed towards the young Callum and others. Damn it. We're dead. That's Master Rowan Fowler. The faces of the fleeing Dawn people all showed despair, including Cullen himself, who also felt that they were dead. They didn't expect that Master Fowler's cavalry could actually chase through the Prince's Pass and chase them all the way to the river reach. They thought they were safe, so they relaxed their vigilance and took a more convenient road, but they were caught up by the enemy. Now they are in danger. The terrain of the river reach is flat and visible, but there are no trees and mountains for them to deal with. The cavalry can kill them all with a single charge. Moreover, it was Owen Fowler, the nephew of old Falcon Franklin Fowler, who personally chased them. Franklin has 2 twin daughters. You must know that Owen is the only male in the Fowler family, so he is very pampered and arrogant all day long without anyone to discipline him. However, at this moment, there is always a way out. When the young man Karen and others fell into despair, the rumbling sound of iron hooves also sounded on the other side of the road leading to Ash Shore in the distance. The fleeing Dornish people hurriedly turned their heads and looked behind them, and then saw a group of knights with the flag of the Zenford family of Ash Shore coming from behind. They were wearing bright and heavy armor, armed to the teeth, and even their war horses were covered with heavy horse armor. Their eyes were full of murderous intent, and the flag bearer held high the white sun flag of the Zenford family. My sunshines. The leading knight also wore the Zenford family emblem on his left arm, and then roared in a low voice. Kill all these invaders. Ha! All the knights of the River Bay raised their spears, and roared in unison in response. It was obvious that the group of Zenford family knights who suddenly appeared in the back were targeting the group of Dornish cavalry chasing the traitors, and they didn't even look at Karen and others. Because this group of Dornish cavalry had crossed the border and came to the land of the local lord and wanted to kill people at will on this land. During this period of time, the conflict between the two sides intensified. This was not the first or second time that the Dornish cavalry had done this. They almost regarded the river reach as their backyard, which naturally aroused the anger of the local nobles. This was their first step in counterattacking. Quick, quick, dodge to one side of the road. Get out of the way. The Dornish people who were sandwiched between the two teams of cavalry seemed to be frightened. Only the young man Cullen reacted first. He realized that the knights of the river reach were not targeting him, and then he hurriedly spoke loudly to remind his companions. All the Dornish people recovered and hurriedly fled to both sides of the road to make way for the cavalry. Charge, charge, charge. On the other side, Owen Fowler, who commanded the Dornish cavalry, saw that the Knights of the River Reach also did not retreat at all, but ordered to speed up and rush up. Bang, but at this moment, a cold arrow suddenly shot out from the Knights of the Zenford family, directly and accurately hitting Sir Owen Fowler, the leader of the Dorn cavalry. Puff, old Fowler's nephew immediately screamed in pain, then fell off his horse, after being shot by the arrow, stirring up dust. Chapter 639, Border Emergency. The border of Dorne was in danger, and the news broke into King's Landing on a fast horse. Trample, tramp, tramp. A river knight in armor with mottled blood on his body quickly climbed the steps with his hand on the hilt of his sword, and then walked into the throne room. At this moment, the throne room was already crowded with local nobles from King's Landing. Viserys sat on the Iron Throne in the middle, with a Valyrian steel crown inlaid with rubies on his head, and his face was calm. A chair was temporarily added to the side seat not far away. It belonged to Queen Irian. She was holding her daughter Diana Targaryen in her arms, and her face was slightly unhappy. The important ministers of the Royal Council were on the left and right. Standing in the first place was the Prime Minister Jon Connington, followed by two princesses, the eldest princess, Duchess of Summerhall Rhaenys, and Duchess of Dragonstone Daenerys Targaryen. Next up were the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Intelligence, the King's Advisor, the Minister of Agriculture, the Minister of Craftsmen, the Grand Secretary, and others. The ministers of the Royal Council had different expressions. Some looked gloomy, some gloated, and some were silent and expressionless. The young female dragon knight with long brown hair lowered her head and grasped the hilt of the Dark Sister at her waist, then exhaled and raised her head again. In fact, long before the formal request for help, the ravens had already brought the news to King's Landing, and everyone present had more or less heard about the rebellion that broke out in the borderland. The Dornish barbarians are still thieves and have repeatedly violated our borders. They burned almost everything, our farmland, grain, and homes. The one who came for help was a knight from the Mareways family in the Long Table Hall. He knelt on one knee in front of the Iron Throne, and then loudly accused him regardless of the ugly faces of the Queen and the Minister of Justice. Your Majesty, please send troops to quell the rebellion. A month ago, a conflict broke out between the nobles of the two places on the border of Dorne. Although it was not a large-scale war, a knight from the king's territory of the River Reach was killed in the conflict, but it was still within the controllable range. However, not long ago, an incident occurred that caused the conflict between the two sides to suddenly intensify. Owen Fowler, the only male of the Fowler family of Sky City, one of the most powerful lords in Dorne, whose ancestors had once been kings and were called King of the Cliffs and the Sky, and the nephew of Franklin Fowler, was shot and killed by the Knights of the Senford family on his way to the River Reach to hunt down the defecting people, and was buried in the River Reach. Old Falcon was furious when he heard the news, so he assembled 2,000 Dornish soldiers from his family and rushed into the River Reach to burn, kill, and loot, breaking through the Senshu Beach castle. Except for Lord Senford, the rest of the Senford family members and women were killed by the Dornish before they could escape. The Fowler family's move angered the nobles of the River Bay, and they gathered their soldiers to fight back. The two sides fought 3 fierce battles, but it was difficult to determine the winner. At this moment, Franklin Fowler, who was the guardian of the pass, also vented his anger, but after the old Falcon calmed down and felt that things were not going well, he retreated to the Prince's Pass and stayed at the pass without going out. But the Fowler family retreated, but the River Noble Alliance did not retreat. Instead, they relied on their own private soldiers, totaling several thousand people, to station troops in front of the Prince's Pass and set up a posture not to attack the city, but not to retreat, in order to seek justice for the Senford family. At the same time, on another route, they sent knights from the Mareways family to King's Landing to ask for help from His Majesty the King, claiming that a rebellion had occurred in Dorne, and asking His Majesty to uphold justice. After the voice of Sarakan Meriveth fell, the nobles in the throne room could not help but whisper to each other. They discussed the audacious King of the Sky, and secretly cast their eyes on the Queen of Dawn sitting on the side of the throne room and the Minister of Justice standing at the head. The Dornish were the earliest partners of the Targaryen family, and they also had a queen who gave birth to a daughter for the king. As a powerful foreign relative, Dawn had naturally become the target of public criticism. Most of the nobles present were gloating and wanted to see how the indomitable Martel family would deal with this matter. Your Majesty, I'm willing to personally lead the army to Dawn to quell the rebellion. At this time, after listening to the accusation of Sarek and Meriveth, the Dawnishman standing aside with an ugly face finally couldn't help but stand up. But he didn't explain anything for his compatriots. He knew that Dawn's reputation in the court was not very good at the moment because it had become the target of public criticism because of its excessive power. Therefore, a Baron stood up and volunteered to lead the army to break through the Prince's Pass, capture Lord Franklin Fowler and escort him back to King's Landing for trial. However, a Baron's request was opposed by the Prime Minister John Connington. Although the two had a good personal relationship, since the appointment of the virtuous, the grey red-haired man was upright and inflexible. Public affairs were public affairs, and private affairs were private affairs. Lord Oberyn, as the Prince of Dawn, should take the initiative to avoid suspicion. Prime Minister John Connington said with a cold face, and then turned his head to look at the silver-haired young man sitting on the Iron Throne. Your Majesty, Lord Franklin Fowler, the Guardian of the Pass and Lord of Skyland, defied the laws of the kingdom and mobilized the army to attack the villages and castles in the king's territory of the River Reach without authorization. They killed the wives and children of the Zenford family and burned the homes and farmland of the people. They deserve to be punished. I'm willing to bring Franklin Fowler to justice. John Clinton, wearing the medal of the King's Hand, condemned Franklin Fowler's sins in a voice below, while the silver-haired young man sitting on the cold throne had a calm face from beginning to end, without any waves, and could not see his joy or anger. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the various expressions on the faces of the nobles below, the River Reach Knight kneeling on one knee, a Baron with an ugly face, etc. He did not care much about this matter. A Lord of Skyland violated the laws of the kingdom and could be punished according to the law, just like the Stonerhelm rebellion last year. Yes. Finally, after John Connington had finished speaking, Viserys nodded slightly. Lord John Connington. Your Majesty. The ordinary man wearing the King's Hand walked out from the crowd of ministers. I'll give you 2,000 soldiers to bring him to me. At the same time, send a letter to Sunspear City, asking Prince Doran to explain this. Yes, Your Majesty. John Connington bowed slightly, and then returned to his original position. Chapter 640 Naming Day. After the monthly meeting in the throne room, Viserys, accompanied by his squire Gendry, was about to ride out on horseback to inspect the port. My love. At this moment, Irian came hurriedly with their daughter Diana in her arms and the maid Sansa behind her. Irian? Viserys saw his wife and knew what she wanted to say, then jumped off the horse. Don't worry, your father, Prince Doran, is not so short-sighted. Prince Doran should not be involved in this matter, and he will not be implicated, but as the Prince of Dawn, he should explain this matter. Viserys ran his fingers through his wife's soft hair, then rested his forehead against hers and spoke to comfort her. Is that really the case? Irian was slightly relieved to hear Viserys' assurance. She also felt that her father was not so stupid as to raise an army and start a rebellion under such circumstances, but her worries were still inevitable. It's okay. Viserys shook his head. At this moment, the silver-haired baby girl who was sleeping soundly in Irian's arms seemed to wake up. Her long eyelashes trembled slightly, and then she opened a pair of beautiful lavender eyes, and her father's reflection came into her eyes. Papa. Then Diana spoke in a non-standard tone and a baby voice, with a lovely smile on her face, and opened her arms to let her father hug her. Diana. And no matter how hard-hearted Viserys was outside, he couldn't help but soften his heart when he saw his own daughter. The silver-haired young man put down his dust and then took his daughter from his wife's arms and held her in his arms. Viserys' daughter Diana is about to have her second name day this year. Last year, on the first name day of the little Princess Diana, King's Landing held a grand tournament. The winner could get 10,000 gold dragons. Commoners and nobles could participate in the auditions. The final champion was won by Ser Jorah Mormont of Bear Island. This year, Diana is a little older. She has learned to walk, play with a ball, speak some simple words, answer her parents' questions, and has a certain cognitive concept. Therefore, this year, Viserys decided to take her to the royal forest on her daughter's second name day, to choose a suitable young dragon as her companion on the road to growth. This is also what Viserys promised Tyrion a long time ago, that their daughter will get a dragon. Seeing her husband holding their common daughter and constantly teasing Diana, Tyrion, who was standing aside, couldn't help but feel her worries disappear, and a smile appeared on her face. As a couple, Viserys understood Tyrion, and Tyrion also understood her husband. After all, the two were a combination of political marriages. Tyrion knew in her heart that Viserys didn't like her that much, but she also knew that, whether it was because of responsibility, honor, or bottom line, Viserys would never abandon her, and would always stand in front of her. That's wonderful. The king and queen are so happy. On the other side, the queen's maid, the red-haired girl Sansa Stark, had her hair tied up like a southern girl, and was wearing a light blue dress. She secretly looked at the handsome king and the beautiful queen with envy in her eyes. She really liked the prosperous city of King's Landing, and she liked the luxurious life in the palace even more. If she could, she would live here for the rest of her life and never want to return to the cold north. In her hometown, she couldn't wear pretty little skirts. She had to wear thick animal skins every day to keep warm. She would even shiver if she didn't go back to the house at night. Joffrey happened to pass by here with a broom in his arms. Since the incident of disturbing the princess not long ago, Viserys ordered his mother Cersei to be reprimanded for not disciplining her strictly. At the same time, as Viserys' punishment for him, Joffrey lived in the maiden house all day long and had nothing to do. Except for his younger sister Myrcella, who was still young, the palace did not keep idle people. Joffrey's good days were over, and he needed to find something to do just like his mother. So the golden-haired boy became a glorious palace hygienist, holding a broom and dustbin to clean the areas inside and outside the Red Castle every day. The core areas of the Red Castle, such as Meagher's Tower, became Joffrey's restricted area. Joffrey happened to pass by here with a broom in his hand, and saw the king and queen here. Like a mouse seeing a cat, his eyes dodged and showed deep fear, and then he hurriedly wanted to leave. Sansa also saw Joffrey, but a trace of disgust passed through the girl's eyes. She had heard of the bad deeds of this former prince. When Winterfell fell, Sansa followed her mother and more brothers and sisters to the south to King's Landing. At that time, Sansa still thought that Prince Joffrey was very handsome, especially when Queen Cersei proposed to her mother that she and Joffrey be engaged, but her mother declined the proposal because her father was not around and she could not make a decision alone. Sansa felt a little regretful at that time and even had a quarrel with her mother, but now she is really glad that she escaped the disaster thanks to her mother's foresight. Otherwise, if the Baratheon dynasty collapsed and she married such a person, wouldn't she suffer for the rest of her life? When Sansa looked at Joffrey, she didn't notice that the black-haired boy who was holding the horse for the king on the other side was looking at her with admiration. Knowing to admire Shai, Miss Sansa Stark of Winterfell was beautiful. Gendry had a good relationship with her brother Robb. The two served as the king's attendants together, so it was natural for Gendry to like Sansa. However, Gendry was shy and not good at expressing himself, so he just hid this admiration in his heart. A few days later, the king's hand, John Connington, personally led the army, assembled 2,000 soldiers from the 2nd Legion, stationed in the King's Wood, and set off for dawn with the supplies needed to quell the rebellion. On the other side, the ships and sailors preparing to send troops to the Isle of Narth were also ready, with 2,000 men on this side as well. Then, with the melodious horn sounding at the port of Blackwater Bay, the fleet began to weigh anchor and set sail for the distance, embarking on a journey to represent the kingdom, to travel around the free trade cities. It was unknown how many hardships and dangers this trip would encounter, and this was only the first step. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 641, The Final Path. Time flies. Except for the distant north and dawn, the overall atmosphere of the Seven Kingdoms is still peaceful and the people live and work in peace. The North and Dawn, one in the north and one in the south, are still too far away for most people. In addition to handling government affairs every day, Viserys has not done much in King's Landing in the past few months. Of course, the golden flame in his body is growing slowly. If Viserys hadn't observed it carefully, he might not even notice it. I see. Its growth rate seems to be very slow. In Meaga's tower, the silver-haired young man asked a stone statue. Yes, the accumulation of faith is not so easy. Only the purest faith can be absorbed. I advise you not to rush, the woman in the faceless statue said calmly. After a few months, Merixes is also understanding the changes in the new world and learning the new Valyrian language. The world pattern in the Valyrian period has also undergone earth-shaking changes. The city-states that once surrendered to Valyria have become independent and each is their own master. The city-states established by the slaves of Valyria who escaped have become the trade hub of the new world and have a strong voice. They are just slaves of the empire. Merixes sneered at the existence of Bravos. When the great empire existed, small city-states like Bravos dared not even breathe, but now they have risen up and are domineering. Viserys is also quite curious about the existence of this divine thought. According to his thinking, gods should be high above and not affected by the mundane world. But the one in front of him seems to be very cynical, just like an ordinary person. Don't overestimate the gods, Viserys. Viserys raised his question openly and got the answer from Merixes. The contrast between the strengths and weaknesses of the gods is very obvious. The powerful gods are part of the operation of the entire world and are indispensable, while the weakest gods are nothing more than homeless ghosts. They can't even resist a human being, and can only dissipate between heaven and earth in the end, their souls scattered. As a divine thought, Merixes did not have all the memories of her former master, but she was very familiar with the system of gods. She explained to Viserys in detail the characteristics and differences of various gods. The most common kind of god is to condense divinity through the faith of the people, and finally ignite the divine fire to become a god. And this kind of god is generally limited to a piece of land, country, and race. Leaving this land, or the country is conquered, and the race is extinct, this god will lose the source of power, become a rootless duckweed, and eventually dissipate between heaven and earth. In addition to the simplest and most common path of the god of faith, there are several other gods left. One is the oldest existence. They were born in the early days of this world, even older than the history of the children of the forest, when humans had not yet appeared in this world. At that time, the tide of magic was surging, and many creatures that existed at that time eventually became gods due to some kind of coincidence. This can be regarded as becoming a god by relying on the magic and power accumulated by themselves. Their power is a little stronger than the spirits who became gods through faith. Because of its slow growth, many people did not feel anything when the fire of faith began to burn, but just felt that their spirits became more energetic. Finally, until the moment of his death, he turned into a spirit and sensed the existence of the fire of faith. It still takes a long time to accumulate in the future before he can finally become a god with the existence of a spirit. It is almost impossible for a living person to wait until the moment of faith becoming a god. So Melaxis told Viserys very frankly that there is no need to rush, and it is useless to rush. If you forcefully promote faith and destroy the local religion, in addition to getting yourself in trouble, the effect is likely to be counterproductive and provoke people's backlash. Only the purest faith can be used. The last kind of god is different from faith or power becoming a god. After becoming a god, they comprehend part of the world rules and become gods in this rule field one step ahead. For example, light, darkness, death, time, life, etc. and then divided into water flow, storm, heat, cold, etc. The power of the rules of powerful gods can spread to more distant lands, while weak gods can only use them on one land, even if they understand the rules. But in general, the god of rules is still more powerful than the first two gods who rely on faith or magic and power to become gods. It's just that the gods of rules also have high and low nobility, and their strength is not equal. Merixis herself has no entity, but a divine thought, so she has a deep understanding of the gods. She talked a lot in one breath, which made Viserys a little confused. But there is one point that Viserys understands very well, and Merixis has emphasized it many times. Is the god of faith the lowest among the gods? Viserys finally couldn't help asking after hearing it. There are many classes of gods, but the god of faith seems to be extremely weak, and anyone can ride on his head and shit. He had some expectations for this, but he didn't expect it to be this result. Even Merasis said that the weakest god of faith couldn't even defeat a determined warrior, and was just a poor lonely ghost. The blood of the warrior was enough to scare it away. That's right. The woman in the stone statue didn't deny it, and told him openly. But faith in becoming a god is the only way to become a god now. The tide of magic is getting weaker and weaker, and it has declined a lot compared to the period when the empire existed. It is even more vulnerable compared to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years ago. Relying on magic and power to become a god is simply not a feasible path now. But you. Merasis hesitated slightly when she said this, because she also noticed that Viserys seemed to be an extremely special human. Mortals should not be aware of the fire of faith, but your mental power is too high, almost equivalent to her. Merasis hesitated. Viserys' existence was indeed special, and she had no way to explain it. If Viserys hadn't noticed the existence of the fire of faith and discovered the divinity hidden in the statue, perhaps she would never wake up until she disappeared completely. You are indeed different from other humans. Merasis was silent for a moment, and then he spoke. Perhaps you can make a different path. Viserys. Chapter 642 Underground World. Can you detect any difference between me and others? Merasis? Viserys was silent for a long time before he asked. Differences? No. No? What's wrong? Merasis' voice was a little confused, and the silver-haired young man in Migo's holdfast study relaxed his brows and shook his head. Nothing. He didn't expect that Merasis' divine consciousness could not detect the existence of the black mist either, which had already surpassed humans and reached the level of gods. Is the existence of the black mist even more mysterious than the gods? However, although he didn't get an answer, Viserys was not discouraged. After all, as Merasis said, there are also different levels among the gods, and even the gap between gods is enough to reach the gap between mortals and gods. The weak gods look up to the higher gods, as if they are looking at a god. Although this sentence is a bit confusing, the reality is so naked. Merasis' divine consciousness is not the body of the ancient Valyrian gods after all, and even Merasis' body may not be the top one among the gods. Otherwise, the gods of Valyria would not have been caught in one fell swoop. The existence of the Black Mist may be the top god among all the gods, so it is so mysterious. The handsome silver-haired young man's brows relaxed. He could only persuade himself in this way, but then he thought of a question and asked. Since you just said so much, what is the true form of Merasis? Dragon. Although Merasis has no memory of his true form, he still knows the origin of his true form. Dragon? Viserys was slightly stunned when he heard her words. He didn't expect that the true form of Merasis, the ancient god of Valyria known as the Lord of the Raging Ocean, was actually a dragon. That's right. Balerion, Vagar, Tyrex and other ancient gods of Valyria are all dragons. The woman in the statue said calmly. Has the Targaryen family lost all these records? No. The silver-haired young man's face was slightly tense. These records may have been obliterated by an invisible hand in the long river of history. Viserys only now understood why Egon was obsessed with naming all dragons after the old gods. Although Viserys inherited the power of the old gods of the north and could go back to the past and see some things that happened in the past under the influence of the rules, there were some things that Viserys could not see. For example, the power of the old gods can probably cover Westeros. In this land of Westeros, he can go back to the ancient times. On the other side of the narrow sea, on the continent of Essos, Viserys once tried to control a raven to float across the ocean. This can be done, but there is no way to go back in time on another continent. Viserys once tracked down the traces of the Kingslayer Jaime Lannister. He went back to the eve of King's Landing opening the gates and surrendering many years ago. He saw Cersei instruct the Gold Cloak commander Janis Sterling to capture Jaime and another King's Guard. He also saw Tyrion bribe the sellsword Bronn and hire a group of people to hijack the prisoner car and send Jaime away from Westeros. Viserys sat on the Iron Throne his eyes following behind Jaime through time and space, watching him board the merchant ship to Bravos, and then all the clues were interrupted, because the power of the old gods could not leave this continent, as if there was an invisible boundary, and the farthest was only here. Valyrian, Vaga, and Merixes and other Valyrian ancient gods are all dragons. Viserys frowned, and suddenly felt a little upset. He felt that he was getting closer and closer to the truth, but he didn't know where to start. It was obviously close, but there was no way to touch it. Did they rely on the faith of the Valyrian people, and rely on faith to become gods? No. The voice of the woman in the statue was still calm, and she spoke faintly. I don't know about Merix's past, but she doesn't seem to have become a god through faith. Dragons like Valyrian and Vaga have existed for a long time. They have lived for who knows how many years. Perhaps they have become gods by relying on their power long before they came to the world from the underground. At the same time, they were also the first dragons that the Valyrians encountered. At that time, the Valyrians were just a nomadic people living on the peninsula. They first saw the dance of dragons on the towering 14 fire peaks. So the Valyrians regarded dragons as totems, worshipped them, and believed in them. Merixes said, and Viserys keenly caught what she had just said. Merixes, what did you just say? Dragons came to the world from the underground? What underground world? What world above ground? Wait. Do you mean that our world is now the world above ground? The silver-haired young man was slightly shocked, and then asked in disbelief. Is there another world under the ground? That's where the dragons come from? Impossible. He didn't know why he suddenly thought of the dozen huge abysses in the Valyrian ruins, which were emitting billowing black smoke and rising straight into the sky. The fog that enveloped the entire Valyria and the sea of smoke might have come from this. When Viserys rode Valyrian out of the Valyrian ruins, he caught a glimpse of the black pillars that rose straight into the sky and the bottomless dark abyss. At the same time, Viserys also remembered that there was a small bottomless pit in the cave below the weirwood body suppressed in the far north of the Great Wall. That bottomless pit became one of the ways for the children of the forest to end their lives, and those who entered it never came out again. However, compared with the dozen giant abysses in the Valyrian ruins, the small bottomless pit in the north is nothing compared to the big one, and the volume of the two is thousands of times different. However, Viserys picked up an obsidian spearhead at the entrance of the bottomless pit, and then went back in time to see that thousands of years ago, the children of the forest, the giant lions of the West Mountain, the giants and other ancient species seemed to join hands to resist a common enemy. They were fighting a giant worm of huge size that could drill into the ground and breathe fire. Both of them have a common feature, that they lead to the mysterious underground world. Could this giant fire-breathing worm, like the dragon, come from the underground and do not belong to this world? And if the dragon really comes from the underground, then what about the black mist wrapped around its body? Could it also come from the underground world? Chapter 643, Winterfell Cellar. Viserys is constantly exploring the next path in King's Landing. He wants to use the fire of faith to awaken the pale raven skull. After he is ready, Viserys asked Merixes if she knew this raven, but Merixes shook her head and said that she had never seen a raven god. It is very likely one of the ancient gods, relying on its own power to become a god. She can sense that there is a powerful divinity in this raven skull. At the same time, the steady progress of the Night's Watch on the other side gradually recovered a large area of land and castles. The soldiers of the Legion braved the severe cold and snow, and measured the land of the north step by step. In fact, the north is vast and sparsely populated, and there are not many castles. If the Night's Watch only recovers the castle, it will not take a few months. It can even capture most castles in less than a month. After all, these scattered wights can't defend the city, but just see the human soldiers, and pounce on them like beasts. The soldiers of the Night's Watch only needed to shoot them with kerosene-soaked bows and arrows from a distance, and they couldn't even get close to the human soldiers. Without the existence of the White Walkers, the brainless wights were no match for humans. However, the difficulty was that the north was vast and sparsely populated, so the soldiers of the Night's Watch had to clear out the wights inch by inch to prevent future troubles when the people of the north moved back. The towering walls of Winterfell stood on this vast and endless plain. Two horses, one brown and one black, ran towards this side, with two knights in black riding on their backs. They were wearing black cloaks and heavy wolfskin capes, and they came from afar in a dusty state. They were the two brothers of the Stark family, Eddard Stark and Benjen. The two brothers rode their horses to the foot of the wall and pulled the reins. Looking up at the nearby Winterfell, they couldn't help but sigh. Winterfell looked like this the last time I left. Eddard Stark exhaled a breath of white air and then spoke. On the other side, his brother Benjen, wearing black leather gloves, raised his hand and pointed to a burnt black mark on the wall not far away. I left later than you, Eddard, and that place was burned by me. Back then, Benjen and other coalition soldiers and Night's Watch brothers were separated from the main force in the Battle of Winterfell. They did not retreat in time and were trapped in the cellar of Winterfell. They relied on the remaining supplies in the cellar to persevere for several months. Finally, they ran out of ammunition and food. They mustered up the courage to rush out and then jumped off the wall with the help of the heavy snow to escape. The burnt mark was left when Benjen pushed down a bucket of kerosene and threw down a torch to ignite it to block the pursuit of the whites. Later, Benjen and others were rescued by the Three-Eyed Raven. The rest of the journey was to find Viserys until they were captured on Dragonstone and later released when King's Landing fell. Winterfell was lost from my hands. Eddard Stark looked at his hometown in front of him, his face full of mixed emotions, and finally sighed. But Winterfell was recaptured from you, Eddard. There is no need to blame yourself. Benjen turned his head and looked at his brother and smiled. The middle-aged man with dark brown hair and beard mixed with a few grey shook his head when he heard it, but still smiled. Let's go into the city. Then the two brothers urged their horses into Winterfell. Winterfell has now been recaptured by the Night's Watch. It only took 2 days to kill all the whites, including the cellars. However, the cellars of Winterfell have collapsed for the most part. Most of the tombs of the King of the North have been buried forever, and the few tombs that are still outside are also deep pits. The two mourners who should have been sleeping in peace have disappeared. When Eddard and Benjen arrived at the cellar, Jir Mormont, the commander-in-chief of the Night's Watch, was already there. He was checking the tomb of the Stark family with a torch. When he saw the owner of this place coming, he stood up and patted Eddard on the shoulder, sighed, and said nothing more. The ancestral tomb was dug up by someone, which was naturally the greatest misfortune of the family, but it was done by the White Walkers. Who can he go to for justice? Commander-in-Chief Mormont. Commander-in-Chief Benjen. Lord Eddard Stark. The three of them simply greeted each other, and then the white-haired and bearded commander of the Night's Watch left the place, leaving it to the two brothers of the Stark family. Soon, when all the outsiders had left, the cellar of Winterfell became quiet, with only the torch in Benjen's hand burning and making crackling sounds. I remember you told me that you had a dream, Benjen. The two brothers looked at the cellar of Winterfell, which had collapsed in front of them, and were silent for a long time. Then Eddard Stark's weather-beaten face suddenly turned around and asked, "Yeah, that's right." The smile on Benjen's face had also disappeared, and he felt a little heavy. He had mentioned this dream to his brother after they reunited in King's Landing. That was when he was trapped in this cellar and was most desperate. Then he dreamed of his sister Lyanna Stark, who had tears and blood in her eyes, and told Benjen to leave quickly. After waking up from the dream, Benjen and his companions mustered up the courage to fight their way out, and they met the Night King who was returning to Winterfell. Fortunately, the Night King was too disdainful to personally chase after a few lingering human soldiers, so Benjen and his companions were able to escape. Benjen, do you think Lyanna still has her own consciousness now? Eddard Stark was silent for a long time, and suddenly said something shocking. What? His brother Benjen on the other side was also slightly stunned, and then looked at his brother in disbelief. It was a consensus that the ancestors of the Stark family, including their relative Lyanna, were manipulated by the White Walkers to resurrect, but he was surprised by Eddard's words. Impossible? Benjen thought for a moment, then shook his head and said, if Lyanna still had her consciousness, why did she shoot Robert with an arrow? However, Benjen swallowed his words before he finished speaking, because he also participated in the public trial in King's Landing. He also heard the love story of his sister Lyanna and Rhaegar Targaryen. Did Lyanna shoot Robert with an arrow to avenge Rhaegar? Benjamin's face was a little surprised, while Eddard Stark on the side was silent throughout the whole process, with a complicated expression on his cheeks. He was the one who knew this history best. Chapter 644. Going alone in the frontier. This wooden bow is what Lyanna used for practice when she was little, do you remember? In the dark cellar of Winterfell, the dim firelight flickered gently, shining on the bluestone statue. Lyanna Stark still had a compassionate look, her hands raised, looking up at the sky. But in fact, this statue doesn't look like Lyanna at all. Eddard wanted to build a statue of a bow and arrow for his sister, but in the end he listened to Mr. Luwin's persuasion and made Lyanna's statue look like this. Remember, this is Lyanna's practice bow. She used this bow to compete with me. Benjen looked at the small wooden bow in his brother's hand. The place where his hand was holding had been polished smooth. This was the result of his sister's day and night practice. There was no talent, only hard practice. Even when he was young, Benjen couldn't beat his sister and cried, and was ridiculed for a long time. This bow was placed in a warehouse in Winterfell after Lyanna died. Even later, even I couldn't find where it was. Eddard's dark brown hair was mixed with some grey, his neatly trimmed beard was also a little grey, and his grey eyes were full of crow's feet. He looked at the small wooden bow in his hand, then raised his head, and asked in a low voice. Then it appeared in Moat Cailin, thousands of miles away. Benjen, do you think Lyanna put it there? Benjen, who was holding a torch in his other hand, and had half of his face illuminated by the flames, frowned slightly when he heard this, and carefully thought about the possibilities contained in his brother's words. But she might also be controlled by the Night King. The White Walkers can control the rest of the Whites, and the Night King can control all the White Walkers. This scene has been witnessed many times in the previous battles with the White Walkers. Humans are very good at learning, so they are constantly learning from experience in the battle with the White Walkers, looking for possible weaknesses of the White Walkers, and then taking advantage of them. In the end, they came to the conclusion that the entire army of the dead and the core power of the White Walkers were in the hands of the Night King. If the Night King was killed, the entire army of the dead could be defeated. But unfortunately, if you want to defeat the Night King, you must first defeat the endless army of the dead surrounding him. So the problem is back to square one. This is also the reason why the White Walkers went south with great momentum. Humans paid a huge price, but could not find a way to defeat the Night King. Unless the Night King himself has a problem with his brain, he gave up the protection of the Whites around him and rushed out alone to take the lead. At this time, the human race ambushed a master who is proficient in assassination, holding a Valyrian steel dagger, and then hit it with one shot, becoming a hero who saves the world. This possibility is not impossible, but the difficulty is that it requires the cooperation of the Night King himself. According to the result of the last one-on-one duel between Viserys and the Night King, the other party was very careful about his life and would retreat at the slightest sign of trouble. But the meaning of this wooden bow is only known to Lyanna, me and you. Eddard Stark was silent for a moment, then suddenly spoke. Father doesn't know, Brandon doesn't know, and Catelyn doesn't know. Benjen was slightly stunned, and then fell into deep thought. The meaning of this wooden bow is indeed only known to the three brothers and sisters of the Stark family. Even the eldest brother Brandon is not very clear. Because the eldest brother Brandon, as the high and mighty heir of Winterfell, was always busy with other things at that time, while the three brothers and sisters ran out to play by themselves. In this way, it is indeed possible that Lyanna was the one who brought this small wooden bow from Winterfell to the Moat Cailin. Because although Lyanna's name was engraved on it, no one except her knew the meaning behind it. Is it true? Lyanna is still conscious? Benjen, who had thought it through, was a little excited. After all, he stayed in Winterfell during the War of the Usurper, and went to serve at the Wall after the war. He didn't have time to see his sister Lyanna for the last time, which has always been his lifelong regret. Then doesn't it mean that father and brother, the cellar of Winterfell collapsed, and the King of Winterfell, the King of the North, and the Duke of Winterfell all woke up, including their father Rickard and their eldest brother Brandon? Lord Wyman Manderley, the Earl of White Harbor, once claimed to have seen Rickard Stark with his own eyes, but at that time he was sneered at by the senior leaders of the coalition, and regarded it as a piece of nonsense. But if it seems like this, becoming a White Walker can restore one's consciousness, isn't this a good thing? It's not confirmed yet. Compared to Benjamin's excitement, Edward looked very calm. Since he got the small wooden bow, Edward has been thinking about it over and over again, and even couldn't sleep at night. Finally, he made a decision in his heart. I'm going to go to the wall myself. Benjamin. What? Benjamin was slightly stunned and hadn't reacted yet. Then Edward Stark just paused for a moment and then suddenly said something shocking. I want to track Lyanna's whereabouts and investigate this matter. Edward has been thinking about the whole thing over and over again for the past few months and finally made up his mind. After regaining the Great Wall, he will fulfill the mission of the Night's Watch Corps and go alone, with one horse and one sword, to the north of the Great Wall to track the whereabouts and lair of the White Walkers and investigate Lyanna's affairs. If this matter cannot be solved, it will almost become a knot in his heart. After all, this concerns his father, brother, and sister. Eddard Stark has always been honorable and protected his family, but now he is wearing black clothes and Winterfell has been entrusted to Robb. He decided to live for himself. Just like the dream of him and Robert when they were young, the two brothers rode their war horses and walked along the King's Road, wielding swords and traveling to the ends of the earth, never to return. No, Eddard. However, Eddard's decision was strongly opposed by his brother Benjamin. As the chief ranger, he once lived alone outside the wall for a period of time, and those days were almost a life and death struggle. He had to find food every day during the day, and a place to sleep at night, so that his throat would not be bitten by wolves. At the same time, he had to guard against an enemy that was more terrible than wild wolves, that is, wildlings, both during the day and at night. However, although there are no wildlings outside the wall now, there are more terrible White Walkers. His brother Eddard wanted to track the traces of the White Walkers alone. Wouldn't that be a death sentence? If you must go outside the wall, why not let me do it? Chapter 645 Prince's Pass. Jon's attack on Prince's Pass was not very smooth. He personally led 2,000 soldiers and the nobles of the Reach gathered 2,000 private soldiers, a total of 4,000 people, to besiege Prince's Pass, blocking the main route to the Reach and Stormlands in the Red Mountains in dawn. Now the cloud of war is looming over this land, and all caravans traveling between the two places need to take a more dangerous bone road, or choose water transportation. Prince's Pass is the main road from Dawn to the outside world. Although the pass is not a very dangerous place, it is still easy to defend, and difficult to attack. The Red Mountains on both sides of the pass are also the barriers of this pass. The Red Mountains can only allow small-scale troops to pass, and large troops cannot move, because the Rocky Mountain roads cannot drive baggage vehicles. Even if the large army crosses the Red Mountains, but there is no food supply, the other side only needs to clear the surrounding villages, and these people can only starve to death, or eat tree bark. Although Jon Connington had been the king's hand for several years, and served as a butler in the rear, he was a veteran on the battlefield, and had rich experience in commanding battles. He believed that the other party would not show mercy when he should. Because the other party knew the king's tactics very well, he should have considered the consequences when he attacked the relatives of Earl Senford in a fit of rage. The worst result is that old Falcon Franklin Fowler was escorted to King's Landing, and then given a noose, or covered in black. The worst result may even be stripped of his title, stripped of the title of Earl of Skyen City, and the Fowler family was driven out of their homeland. If this really happened, then Franklin Fowler would become the eternal sinner of the Fowler family. Therefore, if Earl Franklin Fowler does not want to die, and does not want to become an eternal sinner, he can only drag more people into the water. After all, now that the honeymoon period between Dawn and the Iron Throne is over, the privilege of the Dornish people to run rampant in the Seven Kingdoms has also come to an end. Besides, other areas outside Dawn were implementing a different set of standards, which attracted a large number of Dornish people to seek refuge. The Dornish nobles could hardly find tenant farmers on their feasts, so they would of course be dissatisfied. Although the Dornish nobles did not know how to express themselves, they always felt that they had been trapped since the beginning, when they claimed to demand privileges, and they had gotten into it themselves. However, although the Dornish people were not very good at talking, they were very good at waving their fists to show their strength. When the Dornish people were dissatisfied, they rebelled and expressed their dissatisfaction, and the Iron Throne would deliver sweet dates to them. They were very familiar with this set of business processes. Therefore, the proposal of Franklin Fowler, Earl of Sky City, actually had a certain market in Dawn. Recently, he was resisting the attack of the royal army, while constantly lobbying the rest of the Dornish nobles to join in. The attitude of Sunspear City was ambiguous. Although it expressed opposition, it did not oppose it very firmly. And there were several nobles who were somewhat shaken and seemed to be interested in joining Earl Franklin Fowler's proposal to do something big together. Of course, Sunspear's attitude is not so firm. Perhaps it is not that Prince Doran betrayed his son-in-law, but it may also be a way to express dissatisfaction with the Iron Throne. After all, the current situation in Dawn has indeed become a problem that cannot be ignored. If it continues to develop like this, Dawn's independence will be lost sooner or later. Moreover, it bowed its head and obediently incorporated into the kingdom system. From then on, it lost its autonomy. The indomitable Martell family will also lose the trust and loyalty of the Dornish nobles. He can ignore the loyalty of the people, but he cannot ignore the trust of the nobles under his command. The Martell family has a queen, which is a temporary prosperity. Prince Doran must consider the future status of the Martell family in Dawn, which is the foundation of the family. Otherwise, even if the future king will have the blood of the Martell family flowing in his veins, he will not cede his own interests to the Martell family, because his surname is still Targaryen. Lord John Connington, please do me justice. Those beasts raped and killed my wife, and they killed my son, who was only 6 years old. In the Red Mountains, in front of the Tall Prince's Pass, there are tents stretching far away. White tents, hanging flags of various families, dot this barren and desolate mountain with only jagged rocks. The few grass leaves and trees in the mountains fluttered in the wind, and there was a smell of gravel in the air, which was carried by the strong wind blowing from the desert south of the Red Mountains. He couldn't help coughing for a long time after taking a breath. Dawn's environment and climate are harsh, especially on the hillside, where there are no trees. The bare tents of the king's army are exposed to the sun, and the temperature is rising rapidly. In the central army tent of the king's army, the nobles of the River Baking's territory are now gathered, led by John Connington, the commander of the king's Hand's army, to suppress the rebellion this time. At this moment, the tent was in a mess. Everyone was talking at cross purposes. In addition, the weather was already hot. The listeners just wanted to scratch their heads. They were also more impetuous and spoke in a more aggressive tone. The person who was speaking now was also a victim of this conflict. He was also another protagonist, Earl Senford. The fiefdom of the Senford family, Sinshooten, was breached by the Fowler family. Earl Senford's wife, children, and elders were all killed, including the maids, guards, and chickens, ducks, geese, and 2 dogs in Sinshooten Castle. It can be said that the whole family was wiped out. The attack was extremely cruel. Therefore, the rabbit died, and the fox mourned. This aroused the anger of many nobles and the kings of the River Bay. They shared the same hatred, and gathered many private soldiers to surround the Prince's Pass, to seek justice for Earl Senford. After all, everyone's army has been confiscated now, and only private soldiers within the specifications according to the size of the territory are left, which has shrunk by about 5 to 10 times. In the past, the nobles of the Reach could easily gather an army of 20,000 people, and even if they tried their best, they could gather more than 100,000 people. But now there are only a few left. It would be fine if the Dornish did not attack, but if they did, wouldn't they be putting their necks on the blade of the enemy and waiting to die? Therefore, this time it aroused public anger. The nobles of the kingship of the Reach united and formed a momentum to demand severe punishment for the Fowler family. Not to mention that the king would protect the Fowler family, even if he wanted to. He would have no excuse. Chapter 646 Internal Conflict. Of course, Viserys had no intention of protecting the Fowler family. He had no relationship with Old Falcon, so why should he protect him? However, facing the incident in Skyreach, Viserys was not very angry. He had known that this war would happen. It was just a matter of time. The mine he had buried in Dawn a year or two in advance would eventually explode. But Viserys did not expect that the mine would explode so quickly, and Lord Franklin Fowler ran into the muzzle of his gun. So Viserys just used his head to kill the chicken and the monkey. In fact, these were already very clear when Viserys and John Connington had a final meeting in the study of Migos Holdfast before John Connington withdrew soldiers from the 2nd Legion to the south. He wanted the head of old Franklin Fowler, and the Fowler family must leave Skyreach. Although the Fowler family first wiped out the entire Zenford family, the Iron Throne upholds justice without having its hands stained with blood. Those who make mistakes will be punished, and innocent people will not be implicated. Franklin Fowler's 2 twin daughters did not need to be beheaded for their father's sins. Of course, they will have a hard time after being deprived of their fiefdoms. At the same time, Viserys also explained in advance that, if there are other Dornish nobles who participated in the rebellion, they will be cleared out together, leaving no harm, no mercy, killing the thieves, and depriving the family of their fiefdoms. If necessary, John Connington can send a letter by flying crows to apply for the dragon riders to go south. However, only in Viserys' prediction, the war should not develop to such an intense degree. The resistance of the Dornish people is not united. First of all, the determination of the Dornish people to resist is not firm, and the nobles of Dorne also have their own ideas, which is different from the current situation. When the little Queen Rhaenys burned Dorne 300 years ago, John Connington was ordered by Viserys to go south and lead his army to the expedition to Dorne. Okay, Lord Zenford. I know. Listening to the victim's cry, the middle-aged man with grey-red hair rubbed his temple with a headache and said while looking at the map spread out on the table, he had no idea how to attack the Prince's Pass. Although His Majesty said that when necessary, he could send a letter to request the Dragon Knights to fight and let the dragon flame burn on the land of Dorne again. But now even the door of Dorne has not been knocked open, so it naturally cannot be considered as when necessary. It is not so easy to send out the Dragon Knights, but it must be done with great caution, and this decision cannot be made lightly. After all, the arrival of the dragon in Dorne means that the scale of the war has escalated. It is no longer to quell the rebellion of Sky City, but the invasion of Dorne by the Iron Throne, which can easily arouse the national sentiment and resistance of the people of Dorne. After all, the Dornish people still have a precedent of resisting the invasion of dragons, and the harsh climate of Dorne has hindered the advancement of ground troops. Although the Black Death Balerion 3 is huge now, his growth rate has slowed down a lot as his size and tonnage increase, far from reaching the size of the previous Black Death. Therefore, John Connington will not easily ask the Iron Throne to send dragon riders south before the most critical moment. Otherwise, it will not only show his incompetence, but also lead to the escalation of the scale of the war. He does not want His Majesty to think that he is incompetent. What is Lord John Connington's plan? Let us break through the Prince's Pass and bring the murderer to justice? I see you have been thinking about it here for a day. In the central army tent, a knight wearing an iris-shaped pattern with a long-winged dragon emblem on the other side couldn't help asking. Because the hot weather in the tent made people upset, the tone of speech was a little rude, and then they were reprimanded by the guards of the Prime Minister. Standing before you is Lord John Clindle, the Hand of King Viserys, the Lord Governor of Stormlands, and the Earl of Storm's End. Watch your words. What did I say? I've been here for a day, can't I ask the result? Besides, when is it your turn to interrupt me when I'm talking to Lord Connington? However, the angry rebuke of the guard of the Prime Minister's tower immediately attracted a fierce rebuttal from the Knight of the Levy family. You. The guard of the Prime Minister's tower on the other side was furious when he heard this, holding the hilt of his sword with one hand and glaring. He grew up in King's Landing, and he usually went in and out of the Red Keep. Who were the people that accompanied Lord John Connington to meet the important ministers of the Royal Council and His Majesty the King? And what kind of dogs were these people in front of him? I didn't expect that they would dare to refute after a few words of reprimand. Shut up. But before the guard of the Prime Minister's tower, who was relying on the power of others, could refute anything, John Connington, who was standing in the middle of the tent and looking at the map with a frown on his face, raised his head. He looked at his guard with some stern eyes and frightened the other party so much that he shrank his neck and dared not speak again. He was not afraid of these bumpkin nobles from other places, but he was afraid of his master because all his power came from the hand of the king. However, although John Connington was unhappy, he did not punish his guard in front of the nobles of the King's Landing, but decided to replace him after returning to King's Landing and use someone else. After all, he led the army south, and although he needed to rely on the strength of some local people, he also had to grasp a measure. It was not appropriate to be too much or too little. The impression left was either strong or weak, which was not a good result. Then John Connington's eyes swept to the knight of the Levy family who had just quarreled. The other party looked unhappy. He was the Knight of the Kingdom, the Earl of Rivendell, and the former captain of the Guard of High Court, but he was scolded by an ordinary guard. But Egan Levy pressed the hilt of the sword and faced John Connington's stern eyes. He didn't say much after all, and chose to swallow his anger. Civil strife before a war is a recipe for defeat. And if you can't calm down, you'll also make the wrong judgment and end up with irreversible consequences. Seeing that the two people who were arguing had shut up, John Connington slowly spoke. His words were like a revelation, causing many of the nobles in the Reach, who were a little too excited to shudder and sober up. They had just been unknowingly affected by the hot weather in Dawn, and had lost their most basic calmness. This was also one of the difficulties in attacking Dawn. Many of the nobles present showed shame on their faces. I have an idea that may be able to break through the Prince's Pass. What do you think? John Connington spoke up and told the strategy he had just thought of to defeat the enemy. Chapter 647 Crossing the Mountains. A few days later, in the early morning, a team of fully armed soldiers of the King's army assembled far away from the Prince's Pass. In front of them was the towering and steep Red Mountains. Although the western section of the Red Mountains was not as steep and dangerous as the eastern section of the Bone Road, it was also very difficult to walk. If you were not careful, you would be buried in the cliffs. And the biggest difficulty in crossing the Red Mountains was not this, but the barrages were unobstructed. The soldiers of the Fowler family in Cheyenne City could see the enemies who tried to cross the Red Mountains from a distance. Many Dawn people who wanted to cross the Red Mountains to escape to the river bay were caught or killed because of this. The Fowler family only needed a few teams of highly mobile desert cavalry and set up beacon towers along the way to guard this stretch of mountains. Therefore, not to mention that the geographical environment of the Red Mountains is harsh and the climate environment is extremely bad, it is impossible to support large-scale military marches. And even if a large number of enemy troops crossed the Red Mountains, it would be impossible to bypass and attack the Prince's Pass. There are no obstacles on the Bear Mountains, and the whole situation is clear. The reconnaissance cavalry of the Fowler family will always be the first to find the enemy's traces, and then inform the pass in front, so that they can prepare to deal with the enemy from the rear. The Prince's Pass is not only a two-way pass that can deal with the enemy in front, but also a two-way pass that can also resist the enemy from behind. This is a reason why the Prince's Pass has rarely fallen in history. Now, the commander of the King's army, the King's Hand, John Clinton, has selected a team of 50 top players from the army in one breath. They are equipped with the most sophisticated weapons and equipment. They set out from the camp of the King's army, crossed the Red Mountains under the guidance of local guides, and then took advantage of the night to sneak attack the Prince's Pass from behind. In the end, a worldwide fire that can be seen by the whole of Dawn will be ignited. On the other side, the main force of the King's division will cooperate with the warriors' attack and launch a fierce attack on the northern gate of Dawn from the front, striving to win this pass in one fell swoop with internal and external cooperation. This was exactly the idea John Clinton had proposed yesterday, and it was now being implemented. My lords, the road we chose is the steepest and most dangerous, and it is almost impossible to pass. But the corresponding Fowler family scouts pay the least attention to this section of the road. They focus most of their attention on the main road into the mountain and set up a watchtower on the ridge. The probability of not being discovered from that side is almost zero. The guide of the King's army was the young man Cullen from the village near Cheyenne City who escaped from the iron hoof of the Fowler family not long ago. It was when Sir Owen Fowler, the only male of the Fowler family, led his troops to pursue Cullen and his group, that they clashed with the Knights of Ash Shore. Then Owen Fowler died on the road, which aroused the strong dissatisfaction of Old Falcon Franklin Fowler, who led his troops to launch a fierce revenge on the Senford family, which eventually triggered the war between the nobles of the King's territory of the River Bay and Dawn. However, Karen, who had escaped from the iron hoof of the Dornish cavalry, has now become the guide of the king's army because of his excellent guiding ability and familiarity with the mountain roads. Karen grew up near the Red Mountains and followed his father to hunt. Karen is the most talented hunter in the whole village, but now this talented young hunter has become the guide of the king's army and plays a very important role in this operation. Are you a Dornishman, boy? Among the 50 good men selected by John Clinton, there are many private soldiers of river nobles. Everyone has selfish motives. When the nobles handed over their military power, they handed over the old, weak, sick and ordinary soldiers, and kept the most elite soldiers for themselves. Although not many people were left, it at least had a psychological comfort effect. Now this knight with short dark hair and a face full of flesh who suddenly spoke up was wearing the emblem of a river noble. He looked up and down at the guide Karen, and then questioned. Although the stone men in Dorne are descendants of the Andals and the First Men, and they themselves are not very different from the people of the Reach in appearance, with brown gold hair and fair skin, some differences can still be heard in some facial details and accents. The Knight of the Reach noticed that the young-looking guide was a Dornishman, and then questioned him. What's going on? How can a Dornish bastard serve as a guide for this operation? The Knight of the Reach suddenly spoke, attracting the attention of the other 49 knights and soldiers present. They were all lowering their heads to organize their equipment, and then they looked up at Karen after hearing his words. The selection of the guide was decided by the King's hand, Lord John Connington. Oliver, are you questioning the order of the Prime Minister? On the other side, a Knight of the Reach who was wiping his sword glanced at the Knight of the Oakwood family and spoke in a faint voice. HMPH. Of course I won't question the order of the Prime Minister. The knight with a face full of flesh snorted coldly and did not jump into the language trap set by the other party. The Oakwood family is not having a good time now. If the news of questioning Lord John Connington spreads, even if the other party may laugh it off, if they get serious, the Oakwood family can't bear the other party's tricks. However, he still cares about the guide's Dornish identity, and many soldiers and knights from the River Bay also look suspicious. I'm afraid this little Dornish bastard is going to lead us directly into the trap of Old Falcon, and then catch us all in one fell swoop. However, as the object of suspicion and accusation by everyone, the guide boy Karen of this mission remained silent throughout the whole process. He did not refute or defend himself. His identity as a Dornishman did not make him feel ashamed. Then, when everyone finished speaking, and their eyes were focused on him, the brown-haired boy spoke in a hoarse voice. I'm a Dornishman. But my father, mother, and brother all died at the hands of the Fowler family. The young man Cullen's words were concise, and made all the knights and soldiers of the River Reach silent, including the Knight of the Oakwood family who questioned him at the beginning. His father was the best hunter in the village, but he did not die on the way to escape. Instead, a month before that incident, he was shot and killed the prey that Master Rowan Fowler had set his eyes on in the mountains. Then, he was identified as evading taxes while selling animal skins, and was eventually beaten to death. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 648 Surprise Attack. The hatred of killing one's father is irreconcilable, not to mention that in Cullen's case, his father, mother, and brother all died at the hands of the Fowler family. There is nothing that can resolve such hatred. Perhaps it is precisely because of this that Lord John Connington chose this Dornish boy as a guide and led 50 of the most elite assassins in the army to attack the prince's pass from behind. The doubts in the eyes of the other knights of the Reach disappeared, and the Knight of the Oakwood family who had doubts at the beginning also patted Cullen's shoulder with apology. Sorry little brother. The boy with long brown hair also showed a little sadness on his face. After such a long time, he has not completely gotten rid of the sadness. But then Cullen shook his head and restrained his emotions, then cheered up and said, "Since we are ready, let's set off. My lords, the road through the Red Mountains is not that smooth. Although most of the Red Mountains are flat, there are more Dornish scouts patrolling the city. They could see far away from the beacon tower, and sending out scouts could expand their surveillance range. Of course, those who tried to cross the Red Mountains could also choose to climb at night, but the chance of casualties was even more alarming. Nowadays, people in this era generally have poor vision at night. If there is no light, it is almost pitch dark. If you step on empty air, you will die. The top predators such as desert wolves and lynxes that move in the mountains at night will target them. It is even better to risk passing under the noses of Dawn Scouts during the day. But now, the 50 soldiers and knights of the King's army are not walking on such a smooth road. It is a steeper and more dangerous road. Because there are so many people on this trip, the attention of Dawn Scouts is the weakest here. The Dawnish people don't think anyone will try to walk this road. The reason why Karen didn't choose this road when he led the villagers to cross the Red Mountains was that most of the villagers were old, weak, sick and disabled. Walking on this road was undoubtedly like sending themselves to death. There was no way to move at night, so they could only take the risk of walking on the front, so they were caught by the Dawn Cavalry. The team on this mission was moving forward in silence. The young Dawn man led the way. He had a thick hemp rope tied around his waist. He used his hands and feet to hook his fingers into the cracks of the rocks. He pulled hard and found it was stable before continuing to climb up. The same was true for the rocks he stepped on. The steep cliff seemed to be close at hand. It was obviously only a short distance away, but it seemed to be far away. Karen looked up at the scorching sun above his head. The sun was a little dazzling. Sweat kept sliding down his forehead. Then he took a deep breath and continued to climb up. Kaka, however, at this moment, a soldier in the army suddenly loosened his hand when he raised his hand to grab the next stone. He instantly lost his grip and fell off the cliff, screaming miserably, and then fell to the ground and turned into a pool of flesh. This companion fell off the cliff by mistake, but his screams before he fell off the cliff and died caused trouble for everyone else. Damn it. The scream was so loud that it could be heard far away in the empty valley. All the soldiers and knights of the King's army who were climbing the cliffs felt their scalps tingling. The knight from the river bend with a face full of flesh could not help cursing. They were now climbing halfway up the mountain. Although the slope was not directly 90 degrees, it was also very steep. If the scream of the companion just now attracted the attention of the Dawnishman, it would only take one person to shoot arrows or even throw stones from above, and none of the people below would be able to escape, and would all die here, including the young guide, Karen. Everyone's heart was lifted up, and they lay tightly on the rock wall, waiting for the final result. But fortunately, after a long while, no Dawnishman heard the sound, and ran over to check. The Dawnish scouts did not seem to be around, so they escaped. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. If anyone falls down, shut up like a man. Don't drag us down. The Knight of the Oak Hat family said viciously, holding a pickaxe, and the rest of the soldiers and knights were silent, as if they had tacitly accepted this rule. Since falling down means death, even if you scream, it will be useless, so it is better to leave the hope of life to others. Continue. Then the group continued to climb up. Not long after, another person fell off the cliff, but this time there was despair in the other person's eyes, but he clenched his teeth and did not make any sound. In the end, there was only the muffled sound of a heavy object falling to the ground like a rag sack. The rest of the people were silent, gritted their teeth slightly, and no one said anything more, and then continued to climb up. The mission was not accomplished before the death. And finally, until the last person climbed to the top of the mountain, a total of 8 people were killed on this dangerous road, including a knight who was awarded a title. However, the people who successfully reached the top did not feel happy, because they knew that this was only half of the task, and there was still a difficult road waiting for them. After crossing the top of the Red Mountains, everyone followed the guide and continued to infiltrate the other side of the mountain. After going through hardships and several dangerous situations, they finally arrived not far behind the Prince's Pass a few days later. However, there are less than half of the people left now, but they have really completed their mission. They successfully reached the back of the Prince's Pass without being exposed under the noses of the Dawnish. Now the Dawnish soldiers stationed behind this pass are still very lax, without any awareness, and have no idea that the enemy has reached their backs. What should we do next? Everyone lay in the surrounding woods and observed the movements of the soldiers at the gate behind the Prince's Pass. They summed up their patrol and guard rules, but there was no excuse to approach the gate. If they just shouted and rushed over, they would probably be shot into a sieve by the Dornish arrows halfway through and buried here, and all their previous efforts would be in vain. My lords, I have an idea. However, at this moment, the Dornish boy Karen, who was lying in the middle of the team, looked at the convoy that was transporting supplies to the pass not far away, and suddenly spoke. As soon as Karen spoke, everyone's eyes fell on him. After going through all the hardships before, everyone now looks at Karen with admiration, and regards him as a comrade in arms with whom they can live and die together. Chapter 649, Robbery. On the road from Shianji City to Prince's Pass, Gilulu, horse hooves stepped on the soft ground, and behind them was a row of carriages loaded with goods, and the wheels made a sound while driving. They were flying the flag of Wangzhang City, a white skull flag with a golden crown on a black background. The family emblem and the name of the city were both from the founder of the Manwudi family, who had killed a river baking in this place. This was a batch of supplies shipped to the front line, mainly carrying Dawn wine, air-dried bacon, and some gold and silver used to reward soldiers. Because of the high temperature and dryness in Dawn all year round, fresh pork, beef and mutton cannot be preserved for a long time. They can only be dried as soon as possible to remove moisture and preserve it by salt pickling. Wangzhang City of the Manwudi family is very close to Prince's Pass. Although they are not the pass guard, they have a close relationship with the Fowler family of Shianji City. This time, the pass guard Earl Franklin Fowler made a mistake and violated the laws of the kingdom, and he must be severely punished. The Fowler family is also actively lobbying other Dornish nobles to join them. Although the Manwudi family did not explicitly express that they would follow the Fowler family to resist the king's army, the risk of raising the flag of rebellion was too high, but they still secretly provided some material support to the defenders. For example, this batch of reward materials will be transported to the rear of the Prince's Pass, and the person who is now in charge of escorting this batch of materials is Dickon Manwudi, the second son of Earl Manwudi. The young Dornish noble master is not a knight who has been awarded a title. Because of its special history and culture, Dawn is somewhat incompatible with other places in Westeros, so there are very few knights who have been awarded in Dawn. At this moment, Dickon Manwudi is riding a warhorse at the front of the team, whistling leisurely, looking very relaxed, and without any defense. He is wearing a sandy yellow robe over scale armor, a white turban on his head, a scimitar on his waist, and a neatly trimmed beard on his face. Behind him, protecting and driving the carriage were 20 or 30 soldiers from the King's Barrow. They were also wearing sandy yellow leather armor with scales sewn on it, holding spears in one hand and metal round shields in the other. The scorching sun above was burning the earth like a fireball. There was no wind blowing, and the weather was extremely hot. All the Dornish soldiers responsible for escorting the supplies had been walking for half a day, and they were all sweaty and exhausted. Sweat kept falling down their foreheads. Take a break, Master Dickon. The pack horses can't move anymore. One of the soldiers from the King's Barrow really had no strength to walk, and couldn't help but ask his master. Snap, but in return, he was whipped by a horsewhip, which made him stagger and almost fall to the ground. Dickon Manwudi, the second son of the King's Barrow, heard the soldier's request and whipped him without hesitation. The smile on his face disappeared, leaving only a cold and stern tone. Hurry up. We can't reach the pass before dark. Do you want me to sleep in the wild with you? Yes, yes. Seeing Master Dickon's anger, the other soldiers of Wangzhang City were exhausted, but they dared not say anything. After all, the other party's father was the Earl of Wangzhang City. They could only cheer up and grit their teeth to continue on their way. However, at this moment, above the head of this caravan, a roar suddenly came from the cliffs on both sides of the Prince's Pass Avenue. Kill them. Then more than 20 good men in the king's army seemed to fall from the sky. No one knew where they came from. They rushed towards them with long swords in their hands. Who are you? What are you doing? The second son of Wangzhang City, Dickon Manwudi, was shocked when he saw this scene. He grabbed the reins with one hand to control the frightened warhorse under his crotch and quickly drew the scimitar from his waist. Damn it. Kill them. Kill them. Then Dickon Manwudi waved the scimitar in his hand and shouted to his soldiers. The Dornish soldiers naturally tightened their weapons without Dickon saying anything. They protected the carriage and watched the enemy rushing towards them. Their throats rolled slightly and they swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Kill. The next moment, the two sides fought in a group, and the clanging sound of weapons colliding and screaming were everywhere. Die. The Dornish soldiers of the Tomb of the Kings fought very bravely, but because they had been traveling under the scorching sun for a long time, their physical strength was seriously exhausted, and several of them even had heat stroke. In such a state, how could the Dornish soldiers be the opponents of the warriors carefully selected by John Clinton from the army? Therefore, the Dornish soldiers were quickly killed and retreated step by step, until the last Dornish soldier was forced into a desperate situation by Oliver. Go to hell. He roared and rushed over with a spear in his hand. Facing the Knight of the Oakwood family, the opponent easily dodged his attack, and then stabbed his throat with a sword. Then he drew his sword, and the body fell to the ground. The Knight of the River Bay wiped the blood off the blade with the opponent's clothes, sheathed the sword again, and looked to the other side. Dickon Manwitty, the second son of the king's graveyard, seemed to want to ride his warhorse, to break out of the encirclement and the chaos just now. But the Dornish young man Karen, who was serving as a guide, seized the opportunity to pounce on him, and pulled him off the horse, fell to the ground, and then was captured alive. Spare my life. Spare my life. My lords, I surrender. I surrender. The second son of the king's graveyard had his turban knocked off his head at this moment, and his whole body was covered in dust, and looked very embarrassed. Dickon Manwitty was very afraid of his life, and he knew he couldn't escape after he fell off his horse, so he simply threw away the scimitar in his hand, raised his hands, and knelt on the ground to surrender. Bah. Coward. On the other side, the Knight of the Reach, who saw the ugly behavior of the Dornish nobles, just put his sword back into the scabbard, and then spat in the direction of Dickon and mocked. The other Knight of the Reach, who was the leader of this trip, and had a slightly cold personality, calmly sheathed his sword. He looked around, looking at the corpses all over the ground, and finally his eyes fell back on Dickon Manwitty, the emblem of the Tombstone City. Which Lord Manwitty are you? Dickon, sir. My name is Dickon. Dickon knelt on the ground and said hurriedly, "Oh, it turns out to be Lord Dickon. It's okay, don't panic. We just need you to do one thing, and we will let you go, as long as you can do it." Chapter 650 Bank. What did the Knights of the Reach want him to do by capturing the nobles of Dawn? Obviously, it was definitely not a good thing. However, Dickon Manwitty was very careful about his life. He didn't want to die here, so even though the cold sweat on his forehead slid down when he heard the other party's request, he still agreed to the other party's request. This was exactly the idea proposed by the Dornish teenager Karen, the guide of this trip, and everyone, including the commander, nodded in agreement, so they began to implement the plan. They observed for a long time, and figured out the pattern of the supply team leading to Prince's Pass, then carefully selected the opponent, and then attacked this supply team. They planned to disguise themselves as a supply team going to Prince's Pass, escorting supplies, mixing in, and then taking the opportunity to make trouble, cooperating with the main force outside to seize Prince's Pass. At this moment, they cleaned up the battlefield, and dragged all the bodies into the woods to bury them hastily, and then changed into the clothes and armor of the Dornish soldiers. The dress customs of Dawn also played a big role. The scarves on their heads covered half of their cheeks, and no one could tell what they looked like before. They all turned into Dornishmen. The unfortunate second son of the king's tomb city was taken hostage, and his face was needed to call for the gate of the Prince's Pass to be opened. Although he was still riding on a warhorse, shaking his head and whistling, there was still a panic in his eyes that was difficult to hide, because there was a tall and fat Dornish soldier following him all the way. The other party had a sharp dagger on his waist. Just before setting off, he gestured at the root of his thigh, telling him that there was a main blood vessel in his thigh, and his dagger had just been sharpened to a sharpness that could be used to shave the spider's leg hair. If Dickon Manwitty dared to shout or say something in front of the gate of Prince's Pass, he would hit him in the thigh. Dickon could no longer be a man from then on, but the thigh was the main blood supply channel for the lower limbs. Once a knife was stabbed hard, and then turned around in the flesh, blood would gush out like a fountain. No one could rescue him in time, and he would die from excessive blood loss. As long as Dickon Manwitty cooperated well, they would not do this. One played the good cop and the other played the bad cop, which frightened the young second son of the Tomb of the Kings so much that his face turned pale. He hurriedly nodded in agreement, and the little thought just now disappeared. He was left riding on the war horse in fear. It took less than half an hour from the beginning of the attack to the end of the cleanup. Fortunately, because the Dornish nobles strictly prevented the people under their rule from escaping, the people of Dorne could not move around casually, and the road to Prince's Pass was also blocked. Therefore, no one else passed by in half an hour. Then the materials escort team set out on a new journey again, but they did not notice that a grey-backed falcon was staring at them with its head tilted on a treetop not far away. It witnessed the whole scene, but did not make any sound, just watched quietly. Viserys still stayed in King's Landing, but he had nothing to do and used the power of the old gods. He separated a part of his mental power and attached it to the grey-backed falcon, watching the battlefield on the Prince's Pass to see what method John Clinton wanted to use to break the city. Interesting. Viserys sat in the study of King Meagher's holdfast, holding the wooden armrest of the chair, tapping his fingers lightly, making a sound. This picture was reflected in his eyes, and he saw what was happening over there at the same time across thousands of miles. Compared with Brandon and the original trajectory, Viserys' mental power is much stronger than him, and now the divine fire has burned in his body. Therefore, Viserys can split his mind, controlling the grey-backed falcon on one side, and still have independent consciousness on the other side, and can think about other things. Your Majesty. On the other side, Illyrio Mopatis, the Minister of Finance, who was reporting to him, showed a hint of doubt on his face. His Majesty was rarely distracted when dealing with government affairs. Now the Minister of Finance's work is to prepare for the overall economic reform of the Seven Kingdoms in Westeros. The Iron Throne Council passed a resolution a long time ago, deciding to establish a central bank similar to the Bravos Iron Bank and the 13 Giants. People can freely deposit and withdraw their family savings, and the Iron Throne will guarantee the depositors. As for how much interest you will get if you deposit money in the bank, of course, don't even think about it. The central bank will not give depositors any interest, but will only charge a small amount of custody fees, and authoritative certification will help depositors preserve their assets. This may not sound very reasonable, but in fact it is very normal in this era. Depositing money in the Iron Bank also requires a custody fee. Because of the special properties of metal currency, whether it is trading, storage or custody, it is very troublesome, and it will be lost, or an accident will occur, if you are not careful. Therefore, depositing money into the vault has become the best solution. Many nobles in the Seven Kingdoms have deposited their savings in the Iron Bank, including the Tyrrell family, which seemed to be on the verge of collapse after the High Garden was confiscated, but did not completely collapse. The Rose family contributed more than 1 million gold dragons to the treasury, but they are still rich and powerful because of the diversification of assets and investments. The core goal of the overall strategy of the Iron Throne in military terms is to recover the North, and quelling the Dawn Rebellion is just an accident. In diplomacy, it is to send troops to the island of Nath. Their farthest mission will visit the Slavers' Bay. Although Westeros does not have slavery, it does not oppose all slavery in the world as domineeringly as Bravos. They sent troops to the island of Nath to protect the former vassal of the empire from being enslaved, so they naturally need to negotiate with the Slavers' Bay. After all, there is no killing without buying and selling. The military and political aspects each have their own goals, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer has been tepid, but Illyrio is actually the busiest person, since the country was pacified. They took a rest and recovered from the wounds left by the war, and then they started to reform the economy. Just like the free trade city-states, they launched a series of economic reforms to break the old financial order. At the same time, when the central bank of the Iron Throne is established, it will also start to change the currency in the future, gradually collecting the old versions of gold dragons, silver moons, even silver deer, bronze stars, etc. on the market, and then remelting them to issue new precious metal coins. Okay, congratulations to EDG. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.